She'd spent months working beside him, a quiet ranch hand with dirt on his boots and kindness in his eyes. They laughed, worked, and dreamed under the same sun, never knowing the truth buried beneath his silence. When he finally revealed who he was, her voice trembled. "I thought you were just a hand," he smiled softly, eyes glistening. "I was seeing who would love me without gold," and in that moment she realized she already had. The lantern swung wild in her grip, its flame guttering against the wind like a dying heartbeat. Eleanor Graves couldn't see more than 3 feet ahead, just white fury and the roar of winter tearing across the valley. Her boots sank deep with every step, snow biting through worn leather, through wool, through skin. But she kept moving, because out there, somewhere in that howling darkness, something had fallen. She'd seen it from the window, a shadow against white, a horse rearing, a body dropping like a stone into the drift. One moment there, the next swallowed whole. And now the storm screamed as if trying to bury the memory of it, trying to make her doubt what she'd seen. But Eleanor Graves had buried a husband in ground harder than this. She knew what doubt cost.
We need to finish this.
The wind shoved her sideways, nearly ripping the lantern from her hand. She caught it, steadied herself, and pressed forward. Her breath came sharp and shallow, freezing in her lungs. The cold wasn't just around her, it was inside her, clawing at her ribs, whispering that she should turn back. That whatever lay out here was already gone. That mercy had a limit, and hers was the warmth she'd just left behind. Then her boot struck something solid. She dropped to her knees, lantern thrust forward. The light caught the edge of a coat, dark wool soaked through, half buried in snow already piling over it like a grave filling itself. She dug with her bare hands, her fingers screaming against the cold, until she found a shoulder, a neck, a face, pale, bearded, younger than she'd expected. His lips were blue, his eyes closed, his skin the color of bone. Blood streaked from his temple down into the snow, dark and fresh, and still warm enough to melt the ice around it. Eleanor didn't pray. She didn't have time for it. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He was heavier than he looked. Dead weight, they called it, and she understood why. Every inch was a war. Her boots slipped, her back burned, her breath came in ragged gasps that the wind stole before they could warm her throat. But she dragged him. 1 foot, 2, 3. The barn was closer than the house, and she made for it like a ship makes for harbor in a storm, desperate, half-blind, guided only by the faint glow of her own lantern reflecting off the snow. When she finally kicked the barn door open, the silence inside was so sudden it felt like falling. The wind still howled beyond the walls, but here was just the sound of her breathing, harsh and animal, and the creak of the old woods settling around them. She pulled him inside and let the door slam shut behind her. The horses stirred in their stalls, snorting soft and nervous. The barn smelled like hay and leather and the faint sweetness of old grain. Eleanor laid the stranger out on the floor near the center post, where the lantern's light could reach him. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking, not from the cold now, but from something closer to fear. She didn't know this man, didn't know his name, his face, his story. For all she knew, he could be a drifter, a thief, a man running from something worse than winter. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the faint pulse she found when she pressed her fingers to his throat. He was alive, barely. Eleanor worked quickly. She stripped his coat, heavy, well-made, the kind that cost more than she'd seen in a year, and found his shirt beneath soaked clean through with snow and sweat and blood. She peeled it away, her breath catching when she saw the scars. Old ones, white and raised, crossing his ribs like a map of pain. New ones, still pink, barely healed. And fresh bruises, dark as thunderclouds, spreading across his side. This man had been hurt before, many times, and recently. She wrapped him in every blanket she could find, piling them over him until only his face showed. Then she climbed the ladder to the hayloft and dragged down an armful of dry straw, spreading it beneath him for warmth. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. When she finally sat back, her body aching and her hands raw, she looked at him, really looked at him. His face was lean, angular, shadowed with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples. His brow was lined, his jaw tight even in unconsciousness, as if he couldn't let go of whatever burden he carried even in sleep. He looked like a man who'd been running a long time. Eleanor reached out, hesitated, then brushed the wet hair back from his forehead. His skin was still cold, but the color was returning, just a little, just enough. "Who are you?" she whispered. The wind answered for him, rattling the barn walls like a ghost trying to get in. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat on an overturned crate near the stranger, the lantern burning low between them, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest like a prayer she didn't know the words to. Every few minutes, she'd lean forward and press her fingers to his throat, checking for the pulse. Every time, it was there. Faint, steady, stubborn. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind howled and shrieked, throwing snow against the barn in great crashing waves, and the cold crept through every crack in the wood, settling over them like a living thing. But inside, the animals were calm. The horses breathed soft and low in their stalls. The barn cat, a scrawny orange thing Eleanor had never managed to name, crept out from the shadows and curled up near the stranger's feet, purring. Even the cat knew something she didn't yet understand. As the hours dragged on, Eleanor found herself studying him more closely. His hands, rough and calloused, bore the marks of labor, rope burns, old cuts, the kind of scars you got from working with your body, not just your money. But his clothes, even soaked and ruined, told a different story. The coat was fine wool, lined with something soft. The boots, though muddy and worn, had been expensive once, and when she'd stripped his shirt, she'd seen the edge of something beneath, a chain, thin and silver, tucked against his chest. She'd left it there. Whatever it wasn't hers to take. But it made her wonder, made her doubt. Men like this, men with scars and fine coats and secrets, didn't just fall off their horses in the middle of nowhere. They ran, they hid, they carried something heavy enough to break them. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the lantern flame. She thought of her husband, Jacob, who'd died 3 winters ago when the fever took him. She thought of the way he'd looked at the end, pale and hollow, his hand cold in hers, his voice just a whisper asking her to be strong. She thought of the grave she'd dug herself because there was no one else to do it, and the way the ground had fought her every inch, frozen solid and unyielding. She'd survived that. She'd survived the loneliness that came after, the winters that seemed longer, the summers that felt shorter. She'd survived the neighbors who stopped visiting, the town that slowly forgot her name, the quiet that filled the house until it felt more like a tomb than a home. She'd survived all of it, but sitting here now in the cold dark, watching a stranger breathe, she wasn't sure what she was surviving for anymore. The stranger stirred. It was small, just a twitch of his fingers, a shift of his head, but Eleanor saw it. She leaned forward, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. His eyes opened. They were gray, storm cloud gray, bloodshot and unfocused but open. He stared at the barn ceiling for a long moment, his breath quickening, his body tensing as if preparing to run. Then his gaze found her. Eleanor didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him take her in, the worn dress, the tangled hair, the face lined with work and worry and years. She watched him decide whether to trust her, and then, slowly, he let his head fall back against the straw. His eyes closed again, but his breathing stayed steady, conscious, but too weak to do anything about it. "You're safe," Eleanor said quietly. Her voice sounded strange in the silence, rough from disuse. "You're in my barn. You fell. I brought you in." He didn't respond, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the faint nod, so small she might have imagined it. "You need rest," she continued, "and warmth, and probably a doctor, but the storm's too bad to ride for one, so you'll have to make do with me." Still nothing. But his hand moved, just barely, fingers curling into the blanket like he was holding on. Eleanor stood, her knees protesting after hours on the cold floor. She picked up the lantern and moved toward the ladder. "I'll bring water in the morning, and food if you can take it. Don't try to move, you'll tear something open." She climbed the ladder slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, but before she reached the top she stopped and looked back. He was watching her, his eyes barely open but watching. And in the low light, she thought she saw something. Fear, maybe, or gratitude, or something too complicated to name. "What's your name?" she asked. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind howled, the barn creaked, the lantern flame danced. Then, in a voice like gravel and smoke, he whispered, "Jonas." Eleanor nodded once. "Jonas," she repeated. "All right, Jonas, don't die in my barn. I've got enough ghosts here already." She climbed the rest of the way up and disappeared into the loft, leaving him in the half-light below. And outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, as if the world itself was trying to bury what had just begun. Dawn came pale and cold, the kind of light that barely counts as morning. Eleanor woke stiff and aching in the hayloft, wrapped in her own coat, her breath fogging in the frozen air. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. The stranger, Jonas. She climbed down the ladder quickly, her heart beating faster than it should. Half of her expected to find him gone, vanished into the snow like a fever dream. The other half expected to find him dead. But he was neither. He was sitting up. His back rested against the center post, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, his face drawn and pale but conscious. His eyes followed her as she descended, wary and measuring, like a man who'd learned not to trust easily. "You're awake," Eleanor said, stating the obvious because she didn't know what else to say. "Barely," Jonas rasped. His voice was rough, damaged by cold or smoke or both. He shifted slightly and winced, his hand moving to his ribs. "How long?" "Since last night. You were out in the storm. I found you." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to piece together a memory he couldn't quite reach. Then he glanced toward the barn door, where thin gray light seeped through the cracks. "The storm? Still going. Lighter now, but it's not safe to ride." Jonas nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, scarred, trembling slightly, and clenched them into fists to still the shaking. "You shouldn't have come out for me." "Probably not," Eleanor agreed. She moved to the corner where she'd left a tin pail the night before, now covered with a thin skin of ice. She broke it with her knuckles and scooped out a handful of snow, holding it out to him. "But I did. So here we are." He took the snow carefully as if it might break and pressed it to his lips. He sucked on it slowly, his eyes closing in relief. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Thank you." Eleanor shrugged. "Don't thank me yet. You're not out of the woods, literally or figuratively." She almost smiled. "Almost. Both." Jonas looked at her again, and this time there was something different in his gaze, something heavier. "You live here alone?" "I do." "That's dangerous." "So's going out in a blizzard to save a stranger," Eleanor shot back. "But I'm still here." He didn't argue, just nodded, like he understood more than she'd said. Then he glanced down at himself, at the blankets, the straw, the barn around them. "I don't have much to offer you, for your trouble. I didn't ask for anything." "I know." He met her eyes. "That's what worries me." Eleanor frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. Finally he looked away. "People don't help for nothing, not in my experience." "Then you've had bad experience," Eleanor said flatly. She turned and walked toward the barn door, pulling it open just enough to look outside. The snow had slowed to a soft fall, the wind dying down to a whisper. The valley stretched out white and endless, clean and cold and unforgiving. Behind her, Jonas spoke again. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Forget it," Eleanor interrupted. She pulled the door shut and turned back to him. "You're right to be careful. World's full of people who'd hurt you for less than a thank you. But I'm not one of them. I pulled you out of the snow because leaving you there felt wrong. That's all." Jonas stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, Eleanor echoed. She crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how small the barn felt with both of them in it. "Can you walk? I can try." "Don't. Not yet. You lost blood, and you're half frozen. You'll just fall over and make more work for me." "Then what do you want me to do?" Eleanor considered. "Stay here. Rest. I'll bring food and water when I can. The storm's clearing, but it'll be another day before the roads are passable. After that—" She trailed off, realizing she hadn't thought that far ahead. "After that, I'll leave," Jonas finished quietly. Eleanor nodded. "After that, you'll leave." She didn't know why the words felt heavier than they should. The day passed slow and strange. Eleanor moved between the barn and the house, bringing Jonas water from the well, a bowl of thin soup she'd made from the last of the salted pork, a crust of bread that was harder than it should be but still edible. He ate slowly, carefully, like a man who wasn't sure his stomach would keep it. He didn't talk much, neither did she, but she noticed things. The way he watched the door, always aware of where the exit was. The way his hand drifted to his chest sometimes, feeling for that silver chain beneath his shirt. the way his eyes followed her movements, not with threat, but with something quieter, curiosity maybe, or loneliness. By afternoon, the storm had died completely. The sun broke through the clouds, weak and pale, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the barn, staring out at the valley, at the endless white that covered everything, the fences, the creek, the road that led to town. It was beautiful, in a way that felt like dying. "You ever think about leaving?" Jonas's voice startled her. She turned to find him watching her from his place against the post, his face shadowed but his eyes sharp. "Leaving where?" she asked. "Here. This place. This life." Eleanor looked back at the snow. "Every day," she admitted. "But where would I go? Anywhere. Somewhere warmer. Somewhere with people. People are overrated." Jonas huffed, not quite a laugh, but close. "Fair enough." Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand." "Not much to understand. I'm a widow with a failing ranch and no money. That's the whole story." "I doubt that." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "What about you? What's your story?" Jonas's expression closed, shudders dropping fast. "Not one worth telling. That's what people say when the story's too heavy to carry." He didn't respond, just looked away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in the blankets. Eleanor pushed off the doorframe and walked back to him. She crouched down, her knees cracking, and looked him in the eye. "I don't need to know who you are, Jonas, or where you came from, or what you're running from. But if you're going to stay in my barn, even for a day, I need to know one thing." "What's that? Are you dangerous?" Jonas held her gaze. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of melting snow from the barn roof, hitting the ground in soft rhythmic beats. Then he said, "Not to you." Eleanor studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the set of his mouth, the weight in his voice. She'd spent enough years reading men to know when they were lying. Jacob had been easy to read, his heart always on his sleeve. The men in town were harder, their kindness conditional, their smiles thin. But Jonas was different. His walls were high, but they weren't made of cruelty. They were made of something else, something that looked a lot like survival. "All right," she said finally. She stood, brushing straw from her knees. "Then you can stay until you're strong enough to ride. After that, you're on your own." Jonas nodded. "Fair enough." Eleanor turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Yeah? Don't lie to me. Ever. I've had enough lies to last a lifetime." Jonas looked at her, his gray eyes steady and sad. "I won't," he said quietly. "I promise." Eleanor didn't know if she believed him, but she nodded anyway and climbed back up to the loft, leaving him alone in the fading light. And outside, the snow began to melt, slow, drop by drop, as if the world was finally ready to breathe again. The first sound Jonas heard each morning was the creak of the barn door, followed by Eleanor's boots on the frozen ground, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of a woman who'd learned to carry her own weight a long time ago. He'd wake before she arrived, his body trained by years of sleeping light, and wait in the half-dark with his eyes closed, listening to her approach like a prayer he didn't deserve. 3 days had passed since the storm. 3 days of thin soup and silence, of watching her move through her work like a ghost haunting her own life. She brought him water. She brought him food. She checked his wounds with hands that were rough but careful, her face unreadable as stone. And then she'd leave, climbing back up to the house without a word, as if he were just another chore to be tended. He didn't blame her. On the 4th morning, Jonas stood. It took longer than it should have. His legs shook, his ribs screamed, and the barn tilted sideways for a moment before righting itself. But he stood. He braced himself against the center post, breathing hard, sweat breaking cold across his forehead despite the chill. When Eleanor pushed through the door a moment later, she stopped mid-step, the bucket in her hand sloshing water onto the straw. "What are you doing?" she asked flatly. "Standing," Jonas said through gritted teeth. "I can see that. I'm asking why." "Because I can't lie here forever." Eleanor set the bucket down and crossed her arms. "You've been here 4 days. That's not forever. It's long enough." Jonas pushed off the post and took a step. His leg nearly buckled, but he caught himself, his hand shooting out to the stall door. He steadied, breathed, and took another step. Eleanor watched him like she was watching a horse learn to walk after a bad fall, interested but not hopeful. You're going to tear something open. Then I'll bleed, Jonas muttered. He made it 3 more steps before his knees gave out. He went down hard, catching himself on his hands, his breath hissing out in a sharp curse. Eleanor was there before he could push himself back up. She hooked her arm under his shoulder and hauled him to his feet with a strength that surprised him. For a woman her size, she was solid, ranch strong, the kind of strong that came from years of lifting hay bales and wrestling fence posts and doing the work of 2 people alone. Stubborn fool, she muttered, guiding him back to the blankets. Runs in the family, Jonas said, sinking down with a groan. Eleanor stepped back, brushing her hands on her skirt. You got family? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jonas looked down at his hands, at the scars and calluses, and said nothing. Eleanor nodded, as if his silence answered everything. Right, stupid question. She turned to leave, but Jonas spoke before she reached the door. I want to work. She stopped, turned. What? I want to work, he repeated, looking up at her. I can't just sit here. Let me help. Eleanor stared at him like he'd spoken a different language. You can barely stand. I can mend things, fix what's broken. I've got hands, don't I? Hands that shake when you lift a cup. They'll stop shaking, Jonas said quietly. Give me something to do, anything. Please. The word hung between them. Please. Soft and rough and too honest. Eleanor's expression shifted, just for a moment, something like pity flickering across her face before she buried it again. There's a fence, she said finally. North pasture. Posts are rotting, wires loose, cattle keep getting through. She paused. But it's cold work, hard work, and if you pass out in the snow again, I'm leaving you there. Jonas almost smiled. Fair enough. Eleanor shook her head, muttering something under her breath that sounded like damn fool men, and walked out. But she left the bucket of water, and when Jonas looked inside, there was a piece of cornbread floating on top, wrapped in cloth to keep it dry. He ate it slowly, tasting salt and something that might have been kindness. The fence was worse than Eleanor had described. Jonas stood at the edge of the north pasture, staring at the sagging line of posts and wire that stretched across the hillside like a scar. Half the posts leaned at angles that defied gravity, their bases chewed through by rot and weather. The wire hung loose in places, coiled tight in others, rusted and sharp and dangerous. A few cattle grazed nearby, eyeing him with the lazy indifference of animals who knew they could walk through whenever they pleased. Jonas exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air, and picked up the mallet. His ribs protested with the first swing. His shoulders burned with the second. By the 10th, his hands were shaking again, and he had to stop, leaning on the post to catch his breath. The sun climbed higher, pale and distant, offering light but no warmth. His coat, Eleanor had returned it to him, cleaned and dried, hung heavy on his shoulders, but the cold still found its way in through the threadbare patches. He worked slowly, one post at a time, digging out the rotted wood, setting a new one, packing the earth tight around it. It was simple work, mindless work, the kind that let his body move while his mind went somewhere else, somewhere darker. He thought about the letter he'd burned, the gold leaf seal half melted in the flames, the elegant script curling into ash. Jonathan Hale, it had read, "Your presence is required," as if he were a piece on a board, a name on a ledger, something that could be summoned and controlled. He thought about the men who'd been following him, the ones he'd lost 2 towns back, riding hard through the night until his horse had collapsed under him, and he'd stumbled on through the snow alone, half dead and too stubborn to quit. He thought about his father, the mines, the money, the weight of a name that felt more like a noose than a legacy, and he thought about Eleanor, the way she'd looked at him that first night, kneeling in the snow with a lantern in her hand, her face lined with exhaustion and something fiercer than mercy. She hadn't asked who he was, hadn't cared. She'd just pulled him out of the cold and given him a chance to breathe. He didn't know what to do with that. "You're doing it wrong." Jonas straightened, his hand instinctively moving to his ribs, and turned. Eleanor stood a few yards away, her arms crossed, her head tilted in that way she had, half judgment, half curiosity. "Am I?" Jonas said, more statement than question. "Post's too shallow. First strong wind, it'll tip." Jonas looked down at the post he'd just set. It looked fine to him, but Eleanor was already walking over, dropping to one knee beside the hole. She dug her fingers into the earth, testing the depth, then shook her head. "Another 6 inches," she said, "and pack it tighter. Use your boot." Jonas watched as she demonstrated, her movements quick and efficient, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing something 1,000 times. When she finished, she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, looking at him expectantly. "You've been watching me," Jonas said. "It's my land. I'm allowed. How long?" "Long enough to know you've never set a fence post in your life." Jonas felt heat rise in his chest, embarrassment maybe, or something closer to shame. "I'll figure it out. You will. But it'll take twice as long if you keep doing it wrong." Eleanor gestured to the next post. "Come on, I'll show you." They worked side by side for the next hour. Eleanor didn't talk much, but when she did, it was to correct his grip or point out where the wire needed to be tighter. Jonas followed her lead, his hands still shaking but steadier now, his body settling into the rhythm of the work. It felt good, honest, like something he could measure and see and prove. When they finally stopped, the sun had climbed to its peak, cold and bright. Eleanor wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt, and looked at the line of posts they'd reset. Not many, but enough. Not bad, she said. Jonas glanced at her, surprised. "That's high praise coming from you. Don't let it go to your head." He huffed. Not quite a laugh, but close. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out over the pasture. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow and something clean, something that felt like starting over. "Why are you helping me?" Jonas asked quietly. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She just kept staring at the horizon, her face unreadable. Then she said, "Because I know what it's like to need help and not get it." Jonas turned to look at her, but she was already walking away, her boots crunching in the snow, her back straight and unbending. He watched her go, and for the first time in a long time he felt something that wasn't guilt or fear or exhaustion. He felt gratitude. The town started talking on the 5th day. Eleanor heard it first from Mrs. Cray, the banker's wife, who stopped her on the road with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, dear," she'd said, her voice sweet as poison. "I heard you've taken in a man." Eleanor had kept walking. "He's recovering. Of course, of course. It's very charitable of you." Mrs. Cray had paused, her smile widening. "Though you know how people talk. Let them, but they did talk." By the time Eleanor made it to the general store, the whispers had already spread like frost across glass. She felt the eyes on her as she moved through the aisles, sidelong glances, hushed conversations that stopped when she got too close. The clerk, a young man named Thomas, rang up her flour and coffee without meeting her gaze. "That's $2, he mumbled. Eleanor counted out the coins, her jaw tight. "You got something to say, Thomas?" He flushed. "No, ma'am." "Then say it or stop looking at me like I've grown a second head." Thomas swallowed hard. "It's just, people are wondering about the man, the one you brought in, wondering what? Who he is, where he came from, if he's—" Thomas trailed off, his face red as a beet. "If he's what?" Eleanor pressed, her voice sharp as a blade. "If he's dangerous, ma'am." Eleanor leaned forward, her hands flat on the counter. "He's a man who nearly died in a storm. I pulled him out. That's all." "Yes, ma'am, but—" "People say he's not from around here. And with the way things are—" "The way things are," Eleanor interrupted, "is none of their damn business. Or yours." She grabbed her bag and walked out, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the glass. Outside, the street was quiet, the buildings hunched under gray sky like vultures waiting. Eleanor climbed onto the wagon and snapped the reins harder than she needed to. The ride home was long and cold. By the time she reached the ranch, her anger had settled into something heavier, something that felt a lot like dread. Jonas was in the barn, working on a bridle that had been sitting broken for months. He looked up when she came in, his hands stilling on the leather, his eyes reading her face in that way he had. "Bad day?" he asked. Eleanor set the bag down harder than she meant to. "Town's talking." Jonas's expression didn't change. "About me, about both of us." He nodded slowly, setting the bridle aside. "What are they saying? That you're dangerous, that I'm foolish for helping you, that we're—" She stopped, her jaw clenching. "That we're what?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes blazing. "Use your imagination." Jonas stood, his movements careful, and crossed the barn. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes. the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "I can leave," he said quietly. "If it'll make things easier for you. Don't be stupid. You can barely ride. I've ridden in worse condition. I don't doubt it." Eleanor crossed her arms, her anger fading into exhaustion. "But that's not the point. Then what is?" She looked at him for a long moment, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she just shook her head. "I don't know. I just know that if you leave now, they win. And I'm tired of letting people win." Jonas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something softer. "You're stubborn. So are you. Fair enough." They stood there in the quiet, the barn settling around them like a second skin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the walls, but inside it was warm, or as warm as it ever got. Eleanor felt the weight lift, just a little, replaced by something that felt almost like companionship. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly. Eleanor glanced at him. "For what? For not throwing me out?" She shrugged. "Day's not over yet." This time, Jonas did smile. It was small, barely there, but real. And when Eleanor turned away to unpack the supplies, she found herself smiling too, just a little, despite everything. A week passed, then two. The snow began to melt in earnest, the creek swelling with runoff, the ground turning to mud that sucked at boots and wheels. Jonas grew stronger. His hands stopped shaking. His color returned. He worked the fence line, repaired the barn roof, fixed the stall doors that had been hanging crooked for months. Eleanor watched him move through the work with a quiet efficiency, his body remembering things his words wouldn't say. They didn't talk much, but they learned each other. Eleanor learned that Jonas woke before dawn, that he didn't like coffee but drank it anyway, that he had a way with horses that bordered on magic. She learned that he flinched at loud noises, that he watched the road too often, that he never left anything unfinished. Jonas learned that Eleanor hummed when she worked, that she hated waste, that she could shoot a rifle better than most men. He learned that she buried her loneliness under layers of routine, that she had a scar on her left hand from a broken bottle years ago, that she still set 2 plates at the table sometimes before catching herself. They orbited each other like stars, close but never touching, until the day old Mr. Cray rode out to the ranch. Eleanor saw him coming from the kitchen window, a lone figure on a gray horse, moving slow and deliberate up the muddy road. Her stomach dropped. She set down the potatoes she'd been peeling and wiped her hands on her apron, her mind already racing. By the time Cray reached the yard, Jonas was standing in the barn doorway, his posture tense, his eyes tracking the old man's approach. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, her face carefully blank. "Mr. Cray," she called out, "what brings you all the way out here?" Cray dismounted with the stiffness of age, his coat buttoned tight against the wind. He was a thin man, all sharp angles and sharper eyes, the kind who counted pennies and remembered debts. "Mrs. Graves," he said, tipping his hat. "I came to check on you, make sure you're managing. I'm managing fine." "Good, good." Cray's gaze drifted past her, landing on Jonas in the barn. "And your guest?" "He's helping with the work," Eleanor said evenly. "I see." Cray's eyes narrowed. "You know him well?" "Well enough." "That's not much of an answer, Mrs. Graves." Eleanor stepped off the porch, her boots squelching in the mud. "With respect, Mr. Cray, it's the only answer you're going to get." Cray's mouth tightened. He glanced at Jonas again, then back to Eleanor. "People in town are worried. A stranger shows up, no name, no story, and you take him in. It's unusual. So is freezing to death in a storm. True. But you understand the concern. We don't know this man. Don't know where he's from, what he's running from." "He's not running from anything," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. "How do you know?" "Because I asked, and he told you the truth." Eleanor hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Cray saw it, and his expression shifted, pity and judgment mixing in equal measure. "Mrs. Graves," he said gently, "I know you've had a hard time since Jacob passed, we all do, but you're vulnerable out here, alone, and good-hearted people. They get taken advantage of. I'm not being taken advantage of. I hope not." Cray stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But if you ever need help, real help, you come to town. You hear me?" Eleanor met his eyes, her jaw set. "I hear you." Cray nodded, satisfied. He climbed back onto his horse, tipping his hat once more. "Good day, Mrs. Graves." He rode off slowly, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Eleanor stood in the yard, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding with anger and something closer to shame. When she finally turned, Jonas was standing behind her. "I should go," he said quietly. "No, Eleanor, no," she repeated, her voice harder now. "You're not going anywhere. Not because of him, not because of anyone." Jonas looked at her, his gray eyes searching. "Why?" Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't have an answer. Or maybe she did, but it was too big, too complicated, too tangled up in grief and loneliness and the stubborn refusal to let the world tell her what to do. "Because you're still healing," she said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. Jonas nodded slowly. All right. They stood there in the mud, the wind picking up around them, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow, and something that felt like change. And in the distance, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. Not a storm, not yet, but the promise of one. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in the small bed that used to feel too big after Jacob died, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house creak around her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters, and she could hear the faint sound of the barn door swinging on its hinge. Jonas must have left it unlatched. She should get up and fix it. But she didn't move. Instead, she thought about Cray's words. Good-hearted people get taken advantage of. She thought about the way Jonas had looked at her in the yard. Guilty, grateful, something else she couldn't name. She thought about the way the town watched her now, their eyes full of questions she didn't want to answer. And she thought about the letter. She'd seen it that first night, when she'd stripped his wet coat, a corner of parchment, gold-edged and expensive, tucked into the inside pocket. She hadn't read it, hadn't even touched it, but she'd seen enough to know it was important enough to hide. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She didn't know who Jonas was. Not really. She knew the scars on his body, the quietness in his voice, the way he worked like a man trying to earn something he didn't think he deserved. But she didn't know where he'd come from, or what he was running from. And maybe, she thought, that was for the best, because the truth was, she didn't want to know. She didn't want to find out that the man fixing her fences was someone else entirely, someone who'd lied, someone who'd hurt people, someone who'd leave the moment he was strong enough. She wanted to believe he was exactly who he seemed, a man who'd lost his way, a man trying to find it again, even if that belief was built on sand. Outside, the barn door kept swinging. Eleanor listened to the rhythm of it, creak, pause, creak, and wondered how long she could keep pretending that everything was fine. Spring came slow and stubborn, like it didn't quite trust the valley to hold it. The snow melted in patches, leaving the earth half naked and raw, mud and grass fighting for dominance across the hillsides. The creek swelled and sang, ice breaking apart in great cracking sheets that tumbled downstream like pieces of a world coming undone. And in the mornings, when the sun finally climbed high enough to matter, the air smelled different, thawed, alive, carrying the faint sweetness of pine sap and wet earth, and something Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. Hope. She stood on the porch with her coffee, watching the valley wake beneath a sky streaked pink and gold. The ranch looked better than it had in years. The fences stood straight. The barn roof no longer leaked. The cattle grazed in the pasture without wandering through gaps that didn't exist anymore. It was still a struggling place, still poor, still lonely, but it was no longer falling apart. And that was because of Jonas. He was out there now, near the woodpile, splitting logs with a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The axe rose and fell, each strike clean and precise. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat despite the cool morning, and his breath fogged in steady clouds. He'd filled out over the past few weeks, his shoulders broader, his face less gaunt, the hollow look in his eyes replaced by something steadier. He looked like a man who was healing. Eleanor sipped her coffee and tried not to think about what that meant, about what came after healing, about the empty barn and silent mornings, and the return to the loneliness she'd carried for so long it had started to feel like skin. She tried not to think about it, but she did anyway. "You planning to stand there all morning, or are we working?" Jonas's voice startled her. He'd stopped chopping and was looking up at her, one hand resting on the axe handle, his mouth curved in something that might have been a smile. Eleanor set her cup down on the railing. "We? Unless you've got someone else hiding around here. Just you and the ghosts." "Well, the ghosts don't pull their weight," Jonas said, hefting the axe onto his shoulder. "So I guess it's you and me." Eleanor shook her head. but she was smiling as she came down the steps. "What needs doing?" "Everything." Jonas gestured toward the southern pasture. "But I was thinking we start with the irrigation ditch. Creek's running high. If we don't clear it, half your land's going to flood by next week." Eleanor looked toward the pasture, where the ditch ran along the fence line, choked with winter debris and dead brush. It was hard work, dirty, cold, back-breaking, the kind of work Jacob used to complain about for days before finally doing it. But Jonas was already walking toward it, the axe still on his shoulder, his stride easy and unhurried. And Eleanor found herself following, her boots squelching through the mud, her heart lighter than it had been in months. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, side by side in the ditch. Jonas hacked at the brush while Eleanor hauled it out, tossing armfuls onto the bank where they'd burn it later. The water ran cold around their boots, soaking through leather and wool, but the sun climbed higher, warming their backs, and the work settled into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Jonas didn't talk much, but Eleanor was learning that his silence wasn't empty. It was full of things he didn't know how to say, or maybe didn't want to. She'd catch him staring at the horizon sometimes, his hands stilling on the axe, his jaw tight, and she'd wonder what he was seeing, what he was remembering, but she didn't ask, because she had her own silences, her own ghosts, and she understood the weight of questions you couldn't answer. "You ever think about what comes next?" Jonas asked suddenly. Eleanor looked up from the tangle of roots she'd been wrestling with. "Next? After this. After the ditch is clear, the fences are fixed, the barn's patched. What comes next?" Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "More work, there's always more work." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Jonas leaned on the axe, his gaze distant. "I mean, do you ever think about doing something different? Going somewhere else? Starting over?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her hands resting in the cold water. "Every day," she admitted. "But thinking's easy. Doing's harder. Why? Because this place is all I have. And leaving means admitting I can't make it work." Jonas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That's not failure. That's survival. Maybe." Eleanor pulled another armful of brush from the ditch and threw it onto the bank. "But survival doesn't feel like much when you've got nothing left to survive for." The words hung in the air, heavier than she'd meant them. Jonas didn't respond right away. He just kept looking at her, his gray eyes searching, as if trying to find something beneath the exhaustion and dirt and walls she kept so carefully built. "You've got more than you think," he said quietly. Eleanor laughed, short, bitter. "You don't know what I've got. I know you saved my life. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you didn't give up when most people would have." He paused. "That's not nothing." Eleanor met his gaze, her throat tight. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't understand, that kindness and hard work didn't mean anything when you were still alone at the end of the day. But she couldn't. Because the way he was looking at her, steady, honest, without pity, made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe he was right. "Come on," she said finally, her voice rough. "We've still got half the ditch to clear." Jonas nodded and picked up the axe again, and they went back to work, the silence between them no longer empty but full of things neither of them could say, but both of them felt. By the time they finished, the sun was slanting low through the trees, painting the valley in shades of amber and rust. Eleanor's back ached, her hands were raw, and her boots were so waterlogged she could feel every step squelching inside them. But the ditch ran clear now, the water flowing smooth and fast, and the pasture gleamed green in the fading light. Jonas climbed out of the ditch and offered her his hand. Eleanor hesitated, then took it. His grip was strong, calloused, warm despite the cold water. He pulled her up easily, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his gray eyes, the faint scar above his left brow, the way his breath came steady and calm. Then he let go, and the moment passed. "Good work," he said, stepping back. "You too." They walked back to the house in silence, the day fading around them. Eleanor could smell the wood smoke from the stove, could hear the horses moving in the barn, could feel the weight of the day settling into her bones like an old friend. It was exhaustion, yes, but it was also something else, contentment. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt it. That night, Eleanor cooked. She hadn't cooked a real meal in months, not since Jacob died and eating became just another chore, another thing to get through. But tonight, for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely, She pulled out the last of the salted ham, the potatoes she'd been saving, the jar of preserves she'd made 2 summers ago and never opened. She worked at the stove while Jonas sat at the table, cleaning tools by lamplight. The kitchen filled with the smell of frying ham and wood smoke, and the quiet between them felt comfortable, domestic almost. Like something that had been there all along, just waiting to be noticed. When Eleanor finally set the plates down, Jonas looked up in surprise. "What's this?" he asked. "Food. I can see that. I mean..." He gestured at the table, at the ham and potatoes, and the preserves glistening red in the lamplight. "This is more than food." Eleanor sat down across from him, suddenly self-conscious. "You've been working hard. Figured you earned a decent meal." Jonas stared at the plate for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he picked up his fork and started eating. Slowly at first, then faster, as if he'd forgotten what real food tasted like. Eleanor watched him, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. "Good?" she asked. Jonas nodded, his mouth full. He swallowed, then looked at her. "Best thing I've eaten in years. It's just ham and potatoes. It's more than that." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. So she just ate. And Jonas did too. And the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither of them wanted to cross, but both of them knew was there. When the plates were empty, Jonas leaned back in his chair, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You already thanked me. I know. But I mean it." Eleanor met his eyes, and for a moment the wall she'd built so carefully felt thin, transparent almost. She could see through to the other side, where something fragile and dangerous waited, something that felt a lot like trust. "You're welcome," she said finally. Jonas smiled, small, barely there, but real, and Eleanor found herself smiling back, despite everything. The days blurred together after that, each one soft and steady, the kind of routine that felt less like survival and more like living. Jonas worked the land. Eleanor worked beside him. They mended what was broken, planted what would grow, cleared the debris of winter, and made room for spring. The ranch breathed again, and so did they. In the mornings, Eleanor would wake to the sound of Jonas chopping wood, and she'd lie in bed for just a moment, listening to the rhythm of it, letting it anchor her before the day began. In the afternoons, they'd sit on the porch with coffee, watching the valley stretch out beneath them, the cattle grazing lazy and fat, the creek singing its endless song. And in the evenings, they'd eat together at the small kitchen table, their conversations brief but weighted, full of things they didn't say but understood anyway. Eleanor stopped noticing when Jonas moved from the barn to the house. It happened gradually, so gradually she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. First it was just meals at the table. Then it was him, sitting by the fire in the evenings, mending tack while she sewed. Then it was his coat hanging by the door, his boots next to hers, his coffee cup on the shelf beside her own. And one night, when the rain came down hard and cold, she found a blanket folded on the chair by the hearth, and Jonas sleeping there instead of in the barn loft. She didn't wake him, didn't ask. She just covered him with a second blanket and went to bed, her heart doing something strange and fluttering in her chest. The next morning, neither of them mentioned it, but the blanket stayed. It was a Sunday when everything changed. Eleanor was in the garden, turning soil for the spring planting, when she heard the horse. She straightened, her back protesting, and shielded her eyes against the sun. A rider was coming up the road, not fast, but deliberate. She felt her stomach tighten. Jonas was at the fence line, but he'd seen the rider too. He set down the hammer and started walking toward the house, his pace measured but tense. By the time the rider reached the yard, Jonas was standing beside Eleanor, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The man who dismounted was young, maybe 25, dressed in clean trousers and a wool coat that looked expensive even covered in road dust. He had dark hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of face that smiled easily but meant nothing by it. "Afternoon," he called out, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for a man named Jonas Hale." Eleanor felt Jonas go still beside her, not frozen, just still, the way a wolf goes still when it catches a scent. "Who's asking?" Eleanor said. The young man's smile widened. "Name's William Marsh. I work for the Hale Mining Company. We've been looking for Mr. Hale for some time now." His gaze shifted to Jonas. "And unless I'm mistaken, I've just found him." The air went cold. Eleanor looked at Jonas, but he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Marsh, his face carved from stone, his hands clenched at his sides. "Jonas?" Eleanor said quietly. Marsh's smile never wavered. "Or should I say Jonathan Hale? Heir to the Hale fortune? Son of the man who owned half this valley before he died." Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her. She took a step back, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the words. Hale Mining Company, heir, fortune. "Jonas," she said again, her voice harder now. "What's he talking about?" Jonas didn't answer. He just kept staring at Marsh, his jaw tight, his eyes flat and unreadable. Marsh dismounted fully and brushed the dust from his coat. "I take it Mrs. Graves here doesn't know who you are." He turned to Eleanor, his expression almost pitying. "Ma'am, the man you've been sheltering is Jonathan Hale. His father owned the Hale Mining Company, one of the richest operations in the territory. When his father died 6 months ago, Jonathan here inherited everything. Land, mines, money, more than most people see in a lifetime." Eleanor's breath came short and sharp. She looked at Jonas, at the man she'd saved, the man she'd fed, the man she'd worked beside and trusted and maybe started to care about. And he still wasn't looking at her. "That true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonas's jaw worked, his hands unclenched, then clenched again. Finally he turned to face her, and the look in his eyes, guilty, haunted, desperate, told her everything she needed to know. "Yes," he said quietly, "it's true." The word hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor took another step back, her mind spinning. Rich, heir, Hale. The name echoed in her memory. Stories she'd heard in town, whispers about the mining company that had driven ranchers off their land, that had bought and sold people like cattle, that had left the valley scarred and bleeding long before she'd ever arrived. And Jonathan, was part of that, had always been part of that. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't. You lied." Eleanor's hands trembled, her vision blurring with something that might have been tears or rage or both. "You let me think you were no one. You let me—" She stopped, her throat closing. Jonas stepped toward her, his hand reaching out. "Eleanor, please, don't." She jerked back, her voice cracking. "Don't touch me." Jonas froze. His hand fell to his side, and the look on his face, broken, lost, would have hurt her if she weren't already drowning in her own pain. Marsh cleared his throat. "I apologize for the intrusion, ma'am, but Mr. Hale is needed back east. There are legal matters to attend to, business decisions that require his signature. We've been searching for him for weeks." "Then take him," Eleanor said flatly. She turned away, her body rigid, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Take him and get off my land." "Eleanor!" Jonas's voice was raw, pleading. "I said get off my land." She didn't turn around, couldn't. Because if she looked at him, she didn't know what she'd do. Scream, cry, hit him, all three. Behind her, she heard Marsh murmur something low, heard Jonas's boots on the dirt, heard the creak of leather as he climbed onto the horse Marsh had brought for him. And then she heard them ride away, the sound of hooves fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the wind and the creak and the terrible crushing silence. Eleanor stood in the yard for a long time, staring at nothing. The sun climbed higher, the cattle grazed. The valley went on, indifferent and eternal. And she was alone again. The house felt too big that night. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her, the chair where Jonas had sat just last night, eating her food and smiling that small, careful smile. The fire burned low in the hearth. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and she thought about going to bed but couldn't make herself move. She kept replaying the moment over and over, the way Jonas had looked at her, the guilt in his eyes, the truth she'd been too blind or too stupid to see. Hale, the name sat bitter on her tongue. She'd heard the stories, everyone had. The Hale Mining Company had come into the valley 20 years ago, buying up land, pushing out families, bleeding the earth dry for gold and silver and copper. They'd made fortunes while ranchers starved. They'd built empires while towns crumbled. And Jonathan, was the son of the man who'd done it all. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, her breath coming ragged. She'd been a fool, a desperate, lonely fool who'd seen a broken man in the snow and thought she could save him. Thought he was like her, lost, struggling, trying to survive. But he wasn't like her. He'd never been like her. He'd been testing her, playing at poverty, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and she'd fallen for it, fallen for him. The thought made her sick. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor, and walked to the window. The barn stood dark and empty across the yard, its door swinging slightly in the wind. She could see the fence posts Jonas had set, the roof he'd patched, the wood he'd split. All of it a lie. Eleanor turned away from the window and climbed the stairs to her room. She didn't bother lighting a lamp, just crawled into bed fully clothed and pulled the blanket over her head, trying to block out the world. But sleep didn't come, because even in the dark, even with her eyes closed, she could still see him, could still hear his voice, could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers when he'd pulled her out of the ditch. And despite everything, despite the lies, despite the betrayal, despite the hollow ache in her chest, she missed him. God help her, she missed him. 3 days passed. Eleanor worked the ranch alone, moving through the chores with mechanical precision. She fed the cattle. She checked the fences. She hauled water and chopped wood and did everything that needed doing, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning. The neighbors started coming by. First, it was Mrs. Brennan from the next ranch over, bringing a loaf of bread and too many questions. "Is it true?" she'd asked, her eyes wide with gossip hunger. Was he really a Hale? Eleanor had taken the bread and closed the door in her face. Then it was Thomas from the general store, riding out with supplies she hadn't ordered. "Heard what happened," he'd said, his voice careful. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right." Eleanor had paid him and sent him away without a word. Then it was Mr. Cray again, his expression smug and vindicated. "I warned you," he'd said, standing in her yard like a crow on a fence post. "I told you he was trouble." Eleanor had picked up the rifle from the porch and told him if he didn't leave in 10 seconds, she'd shoot his horse. He'd left in 5. But the worst part wasn't the neighbors. It wasn't the gossip or the pity or the judgment. The worst part was the quiet. The house echoed. The mornings stretched empty. The evenings dragged on forever. Eleanor would sit at the table with her single plate, her single cup, and feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her like a physical thing. She'd gotten used to him, to his presence, to the sound of his boots on the porch, the smell of wood smoke in his clothes, the way he'd look at her sometimes, like she was something worth looking at, and now he was gone. And she was alone. Again. Eleanor stared at the empty chair and felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, that had already broken a long time ago. Something deeper, something that felt like the last fragile thread holding her together. "Damn you," she whispered to the empty room. "Damn you, Jonas Hale." But the room didn't answer. It never did. On the 4th night, Eleanor found the letter. She'd gone into the barn to check on the horses, and found it tucked into the beam above the stall where Jonas had slept those first few weeks. It was folded carefully, the paper thick and expensive, and her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow knew was his. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. "Eleanor, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know words don't fix what I've done. But I need you to understand. When I came here, I wasn't running from the law. I wasn't running from debt or danger or anything you'd think. I was running from a name, from a legacy I never wanted, from a life that was built on the backs of people like you, good people who worked hard and got nothing for it, while men like my father took everything. I didn't lie about who I was. I just didn't tell you who I'd been. And maybe that's the same thing. Maybe I'm a coward for not saying it sooner. But I was afraid you'd look at me the way you did when Marsh said my name, afraid you'd see me as one of them. You were the first person in my life who ever looked at me and saw someone worth saving, not because of my name, not because of my money, but because you're good, because you're the kind of person who pulls strangers out of storms and doesn't ask for anything in return. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that everything I did here, every fence I fixed, every post I set, every moment I spent beside you, that was real. That was me, not Jonathan Hale, not the heir, just me. I'm going back east. I have to. There are things I need to make right, things my father did, things I can't undo, but maybe I can fix. And when it's done, I don't know where I'll go. But I know I'll never forget you. Thank you for giving me a chance to be someone else, even if it was only for a little while. Jonas." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears she'd been holding back for days. When she finally folded it and slipped it into her pocket, her hands were still shaking, but something inside her had shifted. She didn't know if she believed him, didn't know if it mattered, but she knew one thing. He'd been honest with her in the end, and that was more than most people ever gave. Eleanor climbed back up to the house and sat on the porch, staring out at the valley. The stars were bright overhead, cold and distant, and the wind carried the scent of pine and water and earth, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel quite so alone. The rider came on a Tuesday, when the sky hung low and gray like old wool. Eleanor saw him from the pasture, where she'd been digging post holes in ground that fought her every inch. She straightened, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, and watched the dust rise along the road. Not a single rider this time. 2. Moving fast, purposeful, the kind of men who didn't come bearing good news. Her stomach tightened. She stabbed the post hole digger into the earth and started walking toward the house, her boots heavy with mud, her heart heavier still. By the time she reached the yard, the riders had already dismounted. One was Marsh, the same young man who'd taken Jonas away a week ago, his coat still too fine, his smile still too easy. The other was older, maybe 50, with silver hair and a face carved from granite. He wore a suit beneath his duster, black and expensive, and carried himself like a man who owned everything he looked at, including her. "Mrs. Graves," Marsh said, tipping his hat. "Good to see you again." Eleanor didn't return the greeting. She just stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her gaze moving between the two men. "What do you want?" The older man stepped forward, his movements deliberate and slow. "Mrs. Graves, my name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm the head attorney for the Hale Mining Company." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather case, embossed with gold lettering. "I've come on behalf of Jonathan Hale." Eleanor's jaw tightened at the name. "He's not here. I'm aware, that's why I came." Cross opened the case and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers, bound with red ribbon. "Mr. Hale has instructed me to deliver this to you personally." He held it out. Eleanor didn't move. "What is it?" she asked. "A deed," Cross said simply, "to this property, the land, the house, the structures, everything within the boundaries of your ranch. Mr. Hale has transferred ownership to you, free and clear. No mortgage, no debt, no conditions." Eleanor stared at the papers like they were a snake coiled to strike. "Why? I'm not privy to Mr. Hale's motivations," Cross said, his tone clipped and professional. "I'm simply here to execute his wishes. The deed is legal and binding. All it requires is your signature." "I don't want it." Marsh blinked. "Ma'am?" "I said I don't want it." Eleanor's voice was hard, flat. "Take it back. Tell him to keep his guilt money." Cross's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Mrs. Graves, I understand this may feel unexpected, but this land is worth a considerable sum. Mr. Hale is offering you security, stability, freedom from the financial burdens you've been carrying. I didn't ask for his charity." "It's not charity," Cross said. "It's restitution." The word hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, her breath coming shorter. "Restitution for what?" Cross hesitated, glancing at Marsh. Then he folded the papers and slipped them back into the case. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside." "No." "Mrs. Graves, whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Eleanor crossed her arms, her body rigid. "I'm not inviting you into my house." Cross studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Very well." He clasped his hands behind his back, his posture formal, almost military. 23 years ago, Hale Mining purchased this land from a man named Thomas Brennan. The sale was legal, but the circumstances were questionable. Mr. Brennan was in debt, and the company leveraged that debt to acquire the property at a fraction of its value. When Mr. Brennan refused to leave, the company took measures to ensure his departure. Eleanor felt ice spreading through her veins. "What kind of measures?" "The kind that involved fire," Cross said quietly, "and men with guns." Mr. Brennan's barn was burned, his livestock scattered, his family threatened. He left within a week. Cross paused. "Your late husband, Jacob Graves, purchased this land from Hale Mining 5 years later. He had no knowledge of the company's actions. Neither did you." Eleanor's mind raced, trying to piece together a history she'd never known existed. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Jonathan Hale discovered it 3 months ago, while reviewing his father's business records. And when he learned what had been done, what his family had done, he began the process of returning every piece of land the company had acquired through coercion or force. Cross gestured to the case. This deed is part of that process. You're not the first, Mrs. Graves, and you won't be the last. Eleanor's hands trembled. She clenched them into fists to still the shaking. He didn't tell me. No, Cross agreed. He didn't. But he's been working on this since before he ever came to your ranch. The accident that brought him here, the storm, the fall, wasn't an accident. He was traveling through the valley, cataloging properties when the weather turned. He collapsed on your land because this was one of the places he needed to document. Cross's voice softened, just slightly. Finding you, being saved by you, that was fate. But trying to make this right, that was always his choice. Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her, her understanding of everything that had happened, rearranging itself like pieces on a board. Jonas hadn't been running from his legacy. He'd been confronting it, trying to fix what his father had broken, and she'd sent him away. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back east, settling the estate. There are over 40 properties that need to be returned, and each one requires legal documentation, surveys, negotiations." Cross paused. "It will take months, maybe years, and by the time it's finished, Mr. Hale will have nothing left. No land, no mines, no fortune. He's giving it all back." Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the dirt beneath her nails, the calluses that had become part of her skin. She thought about Jonas, about the way he'd worked, the way he'd fixed what was broken, the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought about the letter tucked in her dresser drawer, the words she'd read so many times she'd memorized them. "I need you to know that everything I did here, every fence I fixed, every post I set, every moment I spent beside you, that was real." "He could have told me," she said quietly. "He should have told me." "Would you have believed him?" Cross asked. Eleanor didn't answer. Because she didn't know. Maybe she would have. Maybe she wouldn't have. Maybe it didn't matter now. Cross opened the case again and held out the papers. "The deed is yours, Mrs. Graves. Whether you sign it today or a year from now, the land is yours. Mr. Hale has made that clear. But I need you to understand something." He met her eyes, his gaze steady and cold. "What his father did to this valley, it can't be undone. The damage is permanent. But Jonathan Hale is trying. He's sacrificing everything to make it right. And that should count for something." Eleanor took the papers. They were heavier than they looked, the weight of them settling into her hands like a promise or a curse or both. She stared at the gold seal, the elegant script, the signature at the bottom, Jonathan Hale, written in the same hand that had penned the letter. "Tell him." She stopped, her throat tight. "Tell him I don't need his land, but I'll take it anyway, because someone should." Cross nodded. "I will." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Graves." He and Marsh climbed back onto their horses and rode away, the dust settling slowly behind them. Eleanor stood in the yard, clutching the deed, watching them disappear into the gray horizon. And for the first time since Jonas had left, she felt something other than anger. She felt regret. The town erupted. By the time Eleanor rode into the general store 3 days later, the news had spread like wildfire. Everyone knew. The clerk, the baker, the blacksmith, the wives gossiping on the church steps. They all knew that Jonathan Hale was giving back the land, that Eleanor Graves had been gifted her property, that the Hale fortune was being dismantled piece by piece, and they all had opinions. "Guilt money," Mrs. Brennan spat, standing near the flour barrels with her arms crossed. "That's all it is. He thinks he can buy forgiveness with paper and ink. Better than nothing," Thomas countered from behind the counter. "My uncle lost his land to Hale mining, never got it back. At least people are getting something now." "It's too late," old Mr. Cray said from his corner chair, his voice bitter as ash. "The damage is done. You can't return a farm that's been stripped for copper. Can't bring back cattle that starved when the creek ran dry. That boy's playing at redemption, but it's just theater." Eleanor stood near the door, listening, her hands clenched around the handle of her basket. She wanted to defend him, wanted to tell them they were wrong, that Jonas wasn't playing, that he was sacrificing everything. But the words stuck in her throat, because part of her agreed with them. "Mrs. Graves," she turned. Sheriff Dalton stood behind her, his hat in his hands, his expression careful. He was a lean man, weathered and quiet, the kind who saw more than he said. "Heard you got your deed." "I did." "Congratulations." Eleanor didn't respond. Dalton shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Look, I know this is complicated, but the man's trying to do right. That should count for something. Should it? Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He's Jonathan Hale, son of the man who destroyed this valley. You think signing papers makes up for that? No, Dalton said quietly, but it's a start. He paused. You know, I met him once. The father, Augustus Hale, came through town maybe 15 years ago, riding in a fancy carriage, acting like he owned the world. And he did, in a way. Owned the mines, owned the land, owned the people who worked for him. Dalton's jaw tightened. But Jonathan? He's not his father. I can see that, even if no one else can. Eleanor looked away, her chest tight. It doesn't matter what he is. He's gone. Is he? She frowned. What do you mean? Dalton leaned closer, lowering his voice. Marsh was in here yesterday. Said Jonathan's been asking about the valley, about how people are responding to the land returns. About, he hesitated, about you. Eleanor's heart did something strange, a flutter, a skip, something she didn't want to name. What did Marsh say? Not much. Just that Jonathan wanted to know if you were managing, if you needed anything. Dalton straightened, settling his hat back on his head. Sounds like a man who still cares. Eleanor swallowed hard. Well, he shouldn't. Maybe not, Dalton agreed. But he does. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway, her mind spinning, her heart doing things it had no business doing. She rode home in silence, the basket swinging from her saddle, the sky darkening overhead. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Not a blizzard this time, but something softer. Rain, maybe. The kind that washed things clean. When she reached the ranch, she unsaddled the horse and walked into the house, setting the basket on the table. The deed lay where she'd left it, still unfolded, still unsigned. She'd read it a dozen times since Cross had given it to her, tracing the words with her finger, trying to make sense of what it meant. This land is hereby transferred in full to Eleanor Graves, with no encumbrances, debts, or obligations. It was hers, free and clear. More than she'd ever owned in her life, more than Jacob had ever given her, but it felt empty. Eleanor sank into the chair and stared at the paper. She thought about Jonas, about the way he'd looked at her the day Marsh had arrived, the guilt and fear and something deeper written across his face. She thought about the letter, the apology, the confession. She thought about the way he'd worked beside her, fixed what was broken, made her feel less alone. And she thought about what Dalton had said. Sounds like a man who still cares. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She didn't know what to feel. Didn't know if she had the right to feel anything at all. Jonas had lied to her, or at least he hadn't told her the truth, but he'd also saved her, in a way, saved the ranch, saved her from drowning in the loneliness that had been pulling her under for years, and now he was giving everything away, destroying his own legacy to make amends for his father's sins. That had to mean something, didn't it? That night the rain came. It started soft, a whisper against the roof, then grew louder, drumming hard and steady. Eleanor lay in bed, listening to it, thinking about storms and strangers, and the way life had a habit of breaking you just when you thought you were healing. She thought about Jonas out there somewhere, in some city back east, signing papers and dismantling an empire. She wondered if he thought about her, if he remembered the ranch, the barn, the mornings they'd worked side by side in the cold. She wondered if he regretted leaving, and she wondered, God help her, if she regretted letting him go. The rain fell harder, and Eleanor pulled the blanket over her head, trying to block out the sound, trying to block out the thoughts that wouldn't leave her alone. But they stayed, persistent as the storm, battering against the walls she'd built around her heart. And somewhere, in the deepest part of her, something cracked. Not her heart. That had already broken. Something deeper, something that felt like forgiveness beginning to take root. A week passed. Then two. Eleanor worked the ranch, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. She signed the deed one morning, her hand steady, and filed it at the county office without ceremony. The clerk congratulated her. She nodded and left. The neighbors stopped talking as much. The gossip faded, replaced by new scandals, new stories. Life moved on the way it always did. But Eleanor didn't. She found herself standing in the barn sometimes, staring at the place where Jonas had slept, the blanket still folded in the corner. She found herself setting 2 plates at the table before catching herself. Found herself listening for the sound of boots on the porch that never came. And one night, sitting alone in the kitchen, She pulled out the letter and read it again. You were the first person in my life who ever looked at me and saw someone worth saving. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't let fall. Damn you, Jonas, she whispered to the empty room. Why did you have to leave? But the room didn't answer. And the night stretched on, long and lonely, the way it always had, the way she was afraid it always would. The man who changed everything came on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the barn mucking out stalls when she heard the commotion, raised voices, the sound of hooves. She dropped the pitchfork and walked to the door, wiping her hands on her trousers. A crowd had gathered in her yard. Maybe a dozen people, ranchers, townsfolk, people she recognized but didn't know. And at the center of it all stood a man in a dirty coat, his face red with anger, his voice loud enough to carry. Think he can just buy us off? Think a piece of paper makes up for what his family did? It was Roy Mitchell, a rancher from the North Valley. His father had lost everything to hail mining 20 years ago. Eleanor had heard the stories, the threats, the violence, the way the Mitchells had been driven off their land and left with nothing. Sheriff Dalton was there too, trying to calm the crowd, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Roy, listen to me. No, you listen. Mitchell jabbed a finger toward the sky. That Hale bastard thinks he can make this right by giving back land? By signing papers? My father's dead because of them. Dead. And no amount of deeds or money or pretty words is going to bring him back. The crowd murmured in agreement. Eleanor saw faces she knew. Mrs. Brennan, Thomas, old Mr. Cray. They all looked angry, hurt, hungry for something that looked like justice. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding. What's going on? Mitchell turned to her, his eyes blazing. You're the one who took his money, aren't you? Took the deed and smiled and said thank you. I didn't. You're just like him, Mitchell spat. Thinking you can make it right by accepting what he stole. Well, you can't. None of us can. Roy, that's enough, Dalton said firmly. It's not enough. Mitchell's voice cracked. It'll never be enough. That boy's name is Hale, and that means he's guilty. Guilty of everything his father did, and no amount of charity is going to change that. Eleanor felt something ignite in her chest. Something hot and fierce and protective. He's not his father. The crowd went quiet. Mitchell stared at her, his expression twisted with disbelief. What did you say? I said he's not his father. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice steady now, clear. Jonathan Hale didn't take your land, didn't burn your barns, didn't threaten your families. His father did, and Jonathan's spending everything he has to try to fix it. It's too late for fixing, Mitchell said bitterly. Maybe, Eleanor agreed, but at least he's trying, which is more than most people do. Mitchell shook his head, his mouth curling into a sneer. You've got no idea what you're talking about. You didn't lose what we lost. You're right, Eleanor said quietly. I didn't. But I know what it's like to be judged for something you didn't do, to carry someone else's sins. And I know that Jonathan Hale is trying to make things right, even if it costs him everything. So before you stand in my yard and call him guilty, maybe you should ask yourself what you would do if you were him. If you inherited a legacy built on blood and had to decide whether to keep it or burn it down. The crowd was silent now. Mitchell stared at her, his jaw working, his hands clenched into fists. Then he turned and walked away, shoving through the crowd, his shoulders hunched with rage and grief. The others followed, slowly, their faces uncertain. Dalton stayed behind, his expression unreadable. That was brave, he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. It was stupid, maybe, but it was also right. Dalton tipped his hat. He's lucky to have someone like you in his corner. He rode off before Eleanor could respond. She stood in the yard, her body trembling with adrenaline, her mind racing. She'd defended Jonas. Defended a man who'd lied to her, who'd hidden his identity, who'd left without a fight. And she'd meant every word. Eleanor walked back into the barn and picked up the pitchfork, but her hands were shaking too hard to hold it. She let it fall and sank down onto a hay bale, her head in her hands. What am I doing? She whispered. But deep down she already knew. She was choosing to believe in him, choosing to trust that the man who'd fixed her fences and split her wood and looked at her like she mattered, that man was real. Even if the rest of the world didn't see it. Even if he never came back. Jonas left before dawn when the sky was still black and the stars burned cold overhead. He didn't look back, couldn't. Because if he turned around, If he caught one last glimpse of the ranch, the barn, the house where Eleanor slept, he'd never leave. And he had to leave. Had to finish what he'd started, even if it meant tearing himself apart in the process. Marsh rode beside him, silent for once, the horse's hooves muffled in the soft dirt of the road. They traveled east, toward the railroad depot 2 towns over, toward the cities and courtrooms and lawyers waiting to pick apart his father's empire piece by piece. The sun rose slow and reluctant, painting the valley in shades of gray and gold. Jonas watched it from the corner of his eye, memorizing the shape of the hills, the way the light caught on the creek, the distant line of fence posts standing straight against the horizon. Eleanor's fence posts, the ones he'd set with his own hands, his body aching, his ribs still healing, her voice in his ear telling him he was doing it wrong. He remembered the way she'd knelt beside him in the mud, showing him how to pack the earth tighter, her hands rough and sure. He remembered the way she'd looked at him sometimes, guarded, curious, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. And he remembered the way she'd looked at him when Marsh said his name, like he'd killed something. Jonas's jaw tightened. He pulled his coat closer against the morning cold and kept riding. They reached the depot by noon. It was a small town, barely more than a cluster of buildings huddled around the railroad tracks. But it was loud, voices shouting, cargo clanging, the hiss and shriek of the train engine building steam. Jonas dismounted and handed his horse to a stable boy, his movements automatic, his mind elsewhere. "Train leaves in an hour," Marsh said, checking his pocket watch. "We should get something to eat." Jonas nodded but didn't move. He stood on the platform, staring down the tracks that stretched east into the distance, disappearing into a horizon he didn't want to reach. "You all right?" Marsh asked. "No." Marsh studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I know this is hard. But you're doing the right thing. Am I?" "Yes." Marsh's voice was firm, certain. "Your father built his fortune on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. You're giving it back. That's not easy, but it's right." Jonas turned to look at him. Marsh was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a face that hadn't been hardened by the world yet. He believed what he was saying, believed in justice, in redemption, in the idea that wrongs could be righted with the stroke of a pen. Jonas envied him. "You ever been in love, Marsh?" Jonas asked quietly. Marsh blinked, caught off guard. "What? Love? You ever felt it?" Marsh's cheeks flushed. I don't see what that has to do with... It has everything to do with it." Jonas looked back at the tracks. "Because doing the right thing is easy when you've got nothing to lose. But when you've got something, someone, that makes you want to stay, that's when it gets hard." Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "You're talking about Mrs. Graves." Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marsh shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "You could write to her, explain everything. Maybe She won't." Jonas's voice was flat, final. "And I don't blame her. But you didn't lie to her. Not really. You just..." "I let her believe I was someone I wasn't," Jonas interrupted. "That's the same as lying. Maybe worse." He turned and started walking toward the station house. "Come on. Let's eat." Marsh followed, but Jonas could feel the younger man's eyes on him, full of questions he wouldn't ask. And Jonas was grateful, because he didn't have any answers. The train ride east took 3 days. Jonas spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from rolling hills to flat plains to the jagged edges of cities rising like scars against the sky. Marsh tried to make conversation a few times, about the legal proceedings, about the properties they'd be visiting, about the people who'd be grateful for what Jonas was doing. But Jonas barely heard him. His mind was still in the valley, still in the barn, still at the fence line, still in the kitchen where Eleanor had cooked him the best meal he'd eaten in years, and looked at him like he might be worth something. At night, when Marsh slept across from him in the cramped train compartment, Jonas pulled out the small notebook he carried in his coat pocket. It was worn, the pages soft from handling, filled with lists and numbers and names, properties, families, debts his father had leveraged, land his father had stolen, lives his father had destroyed. 43 properties in total, 43 wrongs to right. Eleanor's ranch was number 7. Jonas ran his finger down the list, stopping at the names he recognized. The Brennans, the Mitchells, the Carsons and the Daltons and the Greers, families who'd been driven out, broken apart, left with nothing while Augustus Hale built monuments to his own greed. And Jonathan then, had been too young to stop it. too powerless, too afraid. But he wasn't powerless anymore. He flipped to a blank page and started writing. Not a letter. He'd already written Eleanor one, and she probably hated him for it. Just thoughts. Words he needed to get out before they choked him. I didn't know how heavy a name could be until I carried yours. How much weight one word, Hale, could put on your shoulders. My father wore it like a crown. I wear it like a noose. You asked me once if I ever thought about leaving. Starting over somewhere else. The truth is, I've been leaving my whole life. Leaving rooms, leaving towns, leaving people before they could see who I really was. Before they could hate me for it. But with you, I wanted to stay. I wanted to wake up every morning and hear you moving around the kitchen, humming those old songs you never finish. I wanted to fix fences and split wood and do the kind of honest work that makes you tired in a good way. I wanted to sit across from you at that table and pretend, just for a while, that I was the man you thought I was. But I'm not. I'm Augustus Hale's son, and that's not something I can run from anymore. Jonas stopped writing. His hand was shaking. He closed the notebook and pressed it to his forehead, breathing slowly, trying to steady himself. Across from him, Marsh stirred but didn't wake. The train rattled on through the darkness, carrying Jonas farther and farther from the only place he'd ever felt like he belonged. The city was everything Jonas hated. Tall buildings crowded together like teeth, streets choked with carriages and people, air thick with smoke and noise, and the smell of too many bodies packed too close. He moved through it like a ghost, Marsh at his side, navigating the maze of law offices and courtrooms and banks where his father's empire had been built and now had to be dismantled. The lawyers were efficient, cold. They laid out the documents in neat stacks, explained the legal ramifications, walked Jonas through each signature like he was a child learning to write his name. And he signed, over and over, page after page, transferring land, dissolving contracts, releasing debts, burning it all down. This one's complicated, said Mr. Harrigan, the lead attorney, sliding a thick folder across the desk. The Mitchell property. Your father acquired it through a forced sale, threatened the family, burned their barn. But the original deed was signed under duress, which makes it legally murky. Jonas opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned, faded, of a family standing in front of a ranch house. A man, a woman, 3 children. They looked tired, hopeful, alive. The father's dead now, Harrigan continued. But the son, Roy Mitchell, still lives in the valley. We can return the land to him, but he'll need to agree to accept it. And given the history, Harrigan trailed off, his meaning clear. Jonas stared at the photograph, set up the meeting. Mr. Hale, I should warn you, the Mitchells are not receptive to this process. Roy Mitchell in particular has been vocal about his feelings regarding your family. I don't care, set up the meeting. Harrigan hesitated, then nodded. As you wish. Jonas slid the folder back across the desk and stood. His body ached from days of sitting, signing, negotiating. His head throbbed from lack of sleep. But he kept moving, kept pushing, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering her. The letters started arriving 3 weeks in. Jonas found the first one slipped under his hotel room door. No postage, no return address. Just his name written in careful script on the front. He opened it slowly, his heart doing something strange in his chest. Mr. Hale, my name is Sarah Carson. You don't know me, but your father knew my husband. Knew him well enough to take everything we had. Our land, our home, our livelihood. My husband died 5 years ago, broken by what your family did. But yesterday, a man came to my door with papers, said you were returning the land, said it was mine again, free and clear. I don't know why you're doing this. I don't know if it's guilt or pity or something else. But I wanted you to know that it matters, that even if it doesn't bring my husband back, even if it doesn't undo what was done, it matters. Thank you. Sarah Carson. Jonas read the letter 3 times, his throat tight. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his notebook, next to the thoughts he'd written about Eleanor. The second letter came 2 days later, then a third, then more. Families thanking him, families cursing him, families asking questions he didn't have answers for. Each letter was a weight, a responsibility, a reminder of everything his father had destroyed. But they kept him going, kept him signing papers, kept him walking into courtrooms, kept him tearing apart the empire one piece at a time. Because if he stopped, he'd have to face the emptiness waiting for him at the end. 6 weeks after leaving the valley, Jonas stood in a lawyer's office in Philadelphia and signed away the last of the mines. It was a cold day, rain streaking the windows, the city gray and lifeless beyond the glass. Mr. Harrigan watched him sign, his expression unreadable, then gathered the papers and slid them into a leather case. "That's it," Harrigan said. "The Hale Mining Company is officially dissolved. All assets transferred, all debts settled. You're done." Jonas set down the pen. His hand was cramping, his fingers stained with ink. "What's left?" Harrigan opened another folder. "Personally, not much. A small account, enough to live modestly for a few years if you're careful. The house in Boston, though that's mortgaged, and a few personal effects your father left in storage." Jonas nodded. He didn't care about the house, didn't care about the money. What about the properties? Are they all returned? 42 of the 43 are complete. The Mitchell property is still pending. Roy Mitchell has refused to meet with you or accept the deed. Jonas's jaw tightened. "I'll go to him." "Mr. Hale, I don't think that's wise. The man is volatile, and given the history, I'll go to him," Jonas repeated, his voice flat. "He deserves to hear it from me." Harrigan sighed, but didn't argue. "Very well. I'll arrange travel back to the valley." Jonas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rain. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, but all he could see was the valley, the ranch, the barn, her. "Mr. Hale?" Jonas turned. Harrigan was watching him, his expression softer now, almost sympathetic. "If you don't mind me asking, what will you do after this? When it's all finished?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know." And it was the truth. Because the man he'd been, Jonathan Hale, heir to a fortune, son of a monster, was gone, burned away like the papers he'd signed, the deeds he'd transferred, the empire he'd dismantled. But the man he wanted to be, the man who'd fixed fences and split wood and sat across a kitchen table from a woman who made him feel human, that man didn't know where he belonged anymore, or if he ever had. Jonas returned to the valley on a gray afternoon in early summer. The land had changed, greened, softened, come alive in ways that made it almost unrecognizable from the frozen wasteland he'd left behind. The hills rolled soft and endless, dotted with cattle and wildflowers, and the creek ran full and bright, singing its endless song. He rode alone this time. Marsh had stayed in the city, tasked with finalizing the last of the legal documents. Jonas was glad for the solitude, glad to be away from the noise and the crowds and the weight of other people's expectations. He didn't go to Eleanor's ranch. Couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Instead, he rode north to the Mitchell property, or what was left of it. The land stretched out in all directions, wild and overgrown, reclaimed by grass and sage. The house was gone, burned to the foundation, only blackened stones marking where it had stood. The barn was gone too. The fences had collapsed years ago, their posts rotting into the earth. It looked like a graveyard. Jonas dismounted and stood at the edge of the property, the deed folded in his coat pocket, the wind tugging at his hair. He didn't know what he'd expected to find here. Closure, maybe, or absolution. But all he felt was the weight of everything that couldn't be undone. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here." Jonas turned. Roy Mitchell stood 20 yards away, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his face hard as stone. He was younger than Jonas had expected, maybe 30, with a beard gone wild and eyes that burned with old anger. "I came to return your land," Jonas said quietly. Mitchell laughed, sharp, bitter. "Return it? You can't return something that's already dead." "The land's not dead. It's still here, still yours. It stopped being mine the day your father burned my family out of it." Mitchell stepped closer, his hand resting on the rifle. "You think signing a piece of paper makes that right? You think I'm supposed to thank you?" "No," Jonas said. "I don't." Mitchell stopped, his expression shifting, surprise maybe, or confusion. "Then why are you here? Because I owe you this. Not thanks, not forgiveness, just this." Jonas pulled the deed from his pocket and held it out. "The land is yours, free and clear. No debt, no strings. You can build here again, or you can sell it, or you can burn it to the ground. That's your choice. But it's yours." Mitchell stared at the deed like it was a snake. "I don't want it. I know. I don't want anything from you." "I know," Jonas repeated, "but I'm giving it to you anyway." Mitchell's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching. For a long moment, Jonas thought the man might shoot him, might take the rifle off his shoulder and put a bullet through him right there, leave him bleeding in the dirt like his father had left Mitchell's family. And Jonas wouldn't have stopped him. But Mitchell didn't reach for the rifle. He just stood there, staring at the deed, his face twisted with something too complicated to name. "You're a fool," Mitchell said finally. "You know that? Giving away everything. Destroying your own name. For what? You think it changes anything?" "No," Jonas said quietly. "But it's all I can do." Mitchell shook his head. Then slowly he reached out and took the deed. He didn't look at it. Just folded it and shoved it into his pocket, his movements rough and angry. "Get off my land," he said. Jonas nodded. He climbed back onto his horse and turned to leave. But before he rode away, he looked back at Mitchell one last time. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." Mitchell didn't respond, just stood there in the ruins of his father's ranch, the deed in his pocket, the weight of history pressing down on both of them like stones. Jonas rode away, the wind at his back, the valley stretching out before him, and he didn't look back. He stayed in a boarding house in town that night, a small room with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the street. He couldn't sleep, just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling, voices fading, doors closing, the distant bark of a dog. He thought about Mitchell, about the anger in the man's eyes, the way he'd taken the deed like it was a burden instead of a gift. He thought about all the families he'd met over the past 2 months, the grateful ones, the angry ones, the ones who didn't know what to feel. And he thought about Eleanor. He wondered what she was doing right now. If she was sitting on her porch, watching the stars. If she was working in the barn, humming those songs she never finished. If she thought about him at all, or if she'd moved on, buried the memory of him like she'd buried her husband. Jonas closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He'd done what he came to do, given back what his father had stolen, dismantled the empire, made himself into nothing so that others could have something. But it didn't feel like redemption. It felt like drowning. The next morning, Jonas rode out of town before dawn. He didn't have a destination, didn't have a plan, just pointed his horse west toward the horizon and rode. The valley stretched out around him, green and alive, the morning light soft and golden. He passed ranches, farms, homesteads, places he'd returned to their rightful owners, places that would go on without him. He passed the creek where he'd first collapsed, the road where Eleanor had found him, and he passed her ranch. He didn't stop, didn't even slow down, just kept riding, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his heart heavy with everything he couldn't say. But as he passed, he saw her. She was standing in the yard, a bucket in her hand, her hair pulled back, her face turned toward the road. And for just a moment, just one breath, their eyes met. Jonas felt something break inside him, something final. He tipped his hat, a small gesture, a goodbye. Eleanor didn't wave, didn't smile. Just stood there, watching him ride away, her expression unreadable. And then she turned and walked back into the house, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. Jonas kept riding. The sun climbed higher. The valley fell away behind him. And with every mile, he felt lighter, not in a good way, but in the way you feel when you've lost something you can't get back. By the time the sun set, Jonas was miles from the valley, miles from the ranch, miles from the only place he'd ever felt like he could breathe. And he was alone. The way he'd always been. The way he thought he'd always be. The summer heat came like a fist, hard and unrelenting. Eleanor woke each morning drenched in sweat, the air thick and still, the sun already burning through the curtains before she could drag herself from bed. The land baked beneath it, grass turning brown, the creek dropping to a trickle, dust rising from the road like ghosts trying to take form. She worked through it. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant seeing him ride away. His hat tipped in goodbye, his eyes holding something she couldn't name and didn't want to. 2 months had passed since that morning. 2 months of silence. Eleanor threw herself into the work with a ferocity that surprised even her. She repaired the irrigation system, expanded the garden, bought 3 new cattle with money she'd saved from selling wool. The ranch thrived under her hands. Fences straight, fields green despite the heat, everything running smooth as clockwork. But the house stayed empty, and at night, when the heat finally broke and the cool air crept through the windows, Eleanor would sit on the porch with her coffee and stare at the valley, watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting everything gold and red and dying. and she'd wonder where he was. If he was still signing papers, still tearing apart his father's empire, if he thought about her, if he regretted leaving, if he'd ever come back. She hated herself for wondering. The town changed that summer. Eleanor noticed it first at the general store, where the gossip had shifted from Jonas Hale to the families who'd gotten their land back. The Carsons had rebuilt their barn. The Greers had planted crops for the first time in years. Old Mrs. Patterson, who'd lost her homestead when Eleanor was still a girl, had returned to find the deed waiting for her, signed and sealed. "It's a miracle, Mrs. Brennan said one afternoon, standing near the counter with her arms full of fabric, like the good Lord himself reached down and set things right. "It wasn't the Lord," Thomas muttered from behind the register. "It was Jonathan Hale." "Same difference," Mrs. Brennan said, waving a hand dismissively. "Point is, people are coming back. The valley's healing." Eleanor listened in silence, her hands wrapped around a sack of flour. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell them that it wasn't a miracle, that it had cost Jonas everything, that he'd given up his name and his fortune and walked away with nothing. But the words stuck in her throat because she still didn't know how she felt about him. Didn't know if what he'd done was penance or pride or something in between. Didn't know if she'd forgiven him. "Mrs. Graves?" Eleanor looked up. Thomas was watching her, his expression careful. "You all right?" "Fine," Eleanor said, setting coins on the counter. "Just tired." Thomas nodded but didn't press. As Eleanor turned to leave, he called after her. "Mrs. Graves?" For what it's worth, I think what he did was brave. Most men would have kept the money. He gave it all away. Eleanor stopped at the door, her hand on the frame. "Bravery doesn't mean much if you run away when it matters." She left before Thomas could respond, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. The meeting was called for a Thursday evening, in the old church at the edge of town. Eleanor heard about it from Sheriff Dalton, who rode out to her ranch 3 days before with the news. "Town council's gathering, folks," he said, leaning against his saddle. "Everyone who got their land back. They want to talk about what comes next." Eleanor frowned. "What's there to talk about?" "Plenty, apparently. Some folks want to pool resources, help each other rebuild. Others want to figure out how to thank Jonathan Hale." Dalton paused, his gaze steady. "You should come." "Why?" "I've got work to do." "Because people listen to you, Eleanor, whether you want them to or not." Dalton adjusted his hat. "And because I think you've got something to say, even if you don't know it yet." Eleanor watched him ride away, his words sitting heavy in her chest. She went. The church was packed when Eleanor arrived, every pew filled, people standing in the aisles and crowding near the door. The air was stifling, thick with heat and too many bodies, but no one seemed to care. They were talking, arguing, gesturing, voices rising and falling in waves of emotion. Eleanor slipped into a spot near the back, her arms crossed, her face carefully blank. At the front, Mayor Hutchins stood behind the pulpit, trying to bring order to the chaos. He was a small man, balding and round, but his voice carried. "Folks, please, let's settle down and discuss this like civilized people." The crowd quieted, though the tension remained. "As you all know," Hutchins continued, "Jonathan Hale has returned 43 properties to their rightful owners over the past 3 months. 43 families who lost everything to Hale Mining now have their land back. That's unprecedented, and it raises questions about how we move forward, how we rebuild, and how, or if, we acknowledge what Mr. Hale has done. Acknowledge." Roy Mitchell stood near the front, his face red with anger. "You mean thank him? Thank the son of the man who destroyed us?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. "I'm not saying we have to thank him," Hutchins said carefully. "But we should acknowledge that what he did was nothing," Mitchell interrupted. "He didn't give us anything. He returned what was stolen. That's not generosity. That's basic decency." "It's more than basic decency," Sarah Carson said, standing from her pew. She was a small woman, gray-haired and frail, but her voice was strong. "That man gave away everything. His fortune, his legacy, his name. He didn't have to do that. He could have kept it all and none of us would have known the difference. But we did know," Mitchell shot back. "We've always known what the Hales were. And signing papers doesn't change that." The crowd erupted again, voices clashing, arguments building. Eleanor watched it unfold, her stomach twisting, her hands clenched at her sides. "Enough!" The voice cut through the noise like a blade. Everyone turned. Sheriff Dalton stood near the door, his expression hard. "You're all acting like children. fighting over whether a man deserves credit for doing the right thing. But none of you are asking the question that actually matters. And what's that? Mitchell demanded. Dalton's gaze swept the room. What would you have done if you were him? Silence. Dalton stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Think about it. You inherit an empire built on blood, money you didn't earn, land you didn't steal. But it's all yours now. Legal. Yours. You could keep it. Live like a king. Never work another day in your life. He paused. Or you could give it all back. Destroy your own name. Make yourself into nothing, knowing that half the people you help will hate you anyway. The crowd was quiet now, uncomfortable. So I ask again, Dalton said. What would you do? No one answered. Dalton nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He looked at Mitchell. I'm not saying you have to forgive him, Roy. God knows you've got reason not to, but don't stand there and pretend what he did was easy or meaningless, because it wasn't. Mitchell's jaw worked, his hands clenched into fists, but he didn't respond. Dalton turned to the mayor. For what it's worth, I think the town should recognize what Jonathan Hale did. Not with a statue or a ceremony, but with something simple, something that says we remember, that we're grateful, even if we're still angry. Hutchins nodded slowly. What do you suggest? Before Dalton could answer, Eleanor spoke. A marker. Everyone turned to look at her. She felt her face flush, felt the weight of dozens of eyes, but she kept talking. Put a marker at the edge of town, she said quietly. Something simple. Stone, with the names of the families who got their land back, and at the bottom one line, returned by Jonathan Hale. She paused, not forgiven, not forgotten, just acknowledged. The church was silent. Then slowly people began to nod. Sarah Carson stood. I support that. Thomas raised his hand. Me too. One by one voices rose in agreement. Not everyone. Mitchell stayed silent, his face dark. But enough, more than enough. Mayor Hutchins banged his gavel. Then it's decided. We'll commission a marker. Sheriff Dalton, Mrs. Graves, I'd like you to oversee the project. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. Dalton caught her eye and smiled, small, approving. The meeting dissolved into quieter conversations. Eleanor slipped out before anyone could stop her, stepping into the night air, breathing deep. She stood on the church steps, staring up at the stars, feeling something shift inside her, something that felt a lot like forgiveness beginning to take root. The marker took 3 weeks to complete. It was simple, just as Eleanor had suggested. A tall stone, smooth and gray, set on a low platform at the town's edge. Carved into the face were 43 names, families, lives, stories written in stone. And at the bottom, in letters slightly larger than the rest, returned by Jonathan Hale. The day they unveiled it, half the town came. Eleanor stood at the back of the crowd, watching as Hutchins gave a short speech, as families stepped forward to touch the names of their ancestors, as Sarah Carson wept quietly into her handkerchief. No one mentioned Jonas directly. No one called him a hero, but the silence that followed the unveiling felt like something close to respect. Eleanor stayed after the crowd dispersed. She walked up to the marker and ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the rough edges of the stone, the permanence of it. Returned by Jonathan Hale. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just real. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She'd defended him, built a monument to him, and still she didn't know if she'd done the right thing, didn't know if he deserved it, didn't know if she wanted to see him again, or if she'd be better off if he stayed gone forever. Beautiful, isn't it? Eleanor turned. Dalton stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands. You did good work here. It's just a stone. It's more than that. Dalton stepped closer, looking up at the marker. It's a promise that we won't forget what happened, good or bad. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, You think he'll ever come back? Dalton shrugged. I don't know. Would you want him to? Eleanor didn't answer, because she didn't know either. Jonas rode back into the valley on a Sunday, when the heat had finally broken and the air smelled like rain. He came alone, on a horse he'd bought with the last of his money, carrying nothing but a saddlebag and the weight of everything he'd done. The valley looked the same, green and gold, the hills rolling soft, the creek singing its endless song. But it felt different, smaller somehow, like a place he'd dreamed once and couldn't quite remember. He rode through town at dusk, the streets quiet, the buildings dark, and then he saw it, the marker. It stood at the edge of town, tall and gray, catching the last of the sunlight. Jonas dismounted and walked toward it slowly, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He read the names. Everyone. Families he'd met, families he'd helped, families who hated him, and at the bottom, his name, returned by Jonathan Hale. Jonas sank to his knees in the dust, his chest tight, his vision blurring. He pressed his hand to the stone, feeling the cool surface, the permanence of it. They'd remembered him, not as his father's son, not as the heir to a dying empire, as himself. Thought I might find you here. Jonas looked up. Sheriff Dalton stood a few yards away, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jonas wiped his eyes and stood slowly. Dalton. Hale. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Dalton stepped forward and held out his hand. Jonas stared at it, surprise flickering across his face. Then he took it and they shook, firm, steady, the kind of handshake that meant something. Welcome back, Dalton said quietly. Jonas's throat was too tight to speak. He just nodded. Dalton released his hand and gestured to the marker. Town voted to put this up. Not everyone was happy about it, but most agreed you'd earned it. I didn't do it for recognition, Jonas said hoarsely. I know. That's why they gave it to you. Dalton paused. You planning to stay? Jonas looked out at the valley, at the town, at the land he'd returned piece by piece. Then he looked back at the marker, at his name carved into stone. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know where I belong anymore. Dalton nodded. Well, when you figure it out, you know where to find me. He walked away, leaving Jonas alone with the marker and the dying light. Jonas stood there for a long time, staring at the stone, at the names, at the proof that what he'd done had mattered. And then he climbed back onto his horse and rode north, toward the ranch, toward her. Eleanor was on the porch when she saw the rider. The sun had set, the sky streaked with purple and orange, and she'd been sitting with her coffee, watching the day fade. At first she thought it was Dalton. Then she thought it was Mitchell, come to yell at her again. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized the shape of him, the way he sat in the saddle, the set of his shoulders, Jonas. Eleanor's heart did something violent in her chest. She set down her coffee and stood, her hands gripping the porch railing, her body frozen between the urge to run toward him and the urge to run inside and lock the door. Jonas stopped at the edge of the yard and dismounted slowly. He didn't approach, just stood there, his hat in his hands, his face shadowed in the fading light. Eleanor, he said quietly. Her name on his lips felt like a punch. She forced herself to breathe, to stay still, to not let him see how much his presence undid her. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. I came to finish what I started. You already did. You gave away everything, signed all the papers. What's left? Jonas stepped closer, just one step. You. Eleanor's breath caught. Don't. Eleanor? I said don't. Her voice cracked, anger and hurt, and something else bleeding through. You don't get to show up here after 2 months and say things like that. You don't get to ride away and then come back like nothing happened. I know, Jonas said quietly. I know I don't. But I had to come back. I had to tell you. Tell me what? Eleanor demanded. That you're sorry? That you lied? I already know. I read your letter. I defended you to the whole damn town. I built a monument with your name on it. What more do you want from me? Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Nothing. Eleanor stared at him, her chest heaving. What? I don't want anything from you, Jonas said. I just wanted you to know the truth. All of it. He took a breath. When I came here, I was running. Not from the law, not from danger. From myself. From a name I didn't know how to carry. And when you saved me, when you pulled me out of that storm and didn't ask who I was or what I'd done, I thought maybe I could be someone different. Someone better. Eleanor's throat was tight. You lied to me. I didn't tell you the truth, Jonas corrected. And that's the same thing. I know. But everything else, everything I did here, every moment I spent with you, that was real. That was me, not Jonathan Hale, just Jonas. There is no just Jonas, Eleanor said bitterly. You're always going to be a Hale. That's not something you can run from. I know, Jonas said. That's why I came back. Not to run, but to face it, to own it, and to tell you that if I could go back and do it differently, if I could tell you the truth from the start, I would. But I can't. So all I can do is stand here and tell you that I'm sorry, and that you deserved better. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. Why did you come back, Jonas? Really? Jonas looked at her, his gray eyes steady and sad. Because leaving was the biggest mistake I ever made. And because even if you hate me, even if you never forgive me, I needed you to know that you mattered, that you still matter. Eleanor's breath hitched. She wanted to yell at him, wanted to tell him to leave, wanted to protect herself from the hurt that loving him would bring. But she also wanted to step off the porch and close the distance between them. Wanted to see if his arms felt as solid as she remembered. Wanted to know if the man she'd fallen for was real, or if she'd just been fooling herself all along. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered. I know, Jonas said, but I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to let me prove it. Eleanor closed her eyes, her heart warring with her head, her fear warring with something that felt dangerously like hope. When she opened them again, Jonas was still there, still waiting, still real. How? She asked. How do you prove something like that? Jonas smiled, small, sad, but genuine. One fence post at a time. Despite everything, Eleanor felt her lips twitch. Almost a smile. Almost. You're insufferable, she said. I know, and stubborn. Runs in the family. Eleanor shook her head, but the anger was fading, replaced by something softer, something that scared her more than rage ever could. If you stay, she said slowly, you stay as Jonas, not Jonathan Hale, not an heir, just a man willing to work. I can do that, Jonas said quietly. And if you lie to me again, about anything, you're gone. No second chances. Understood. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was just another performance. But all she saw was exhaustion, sincerity, hope. There's a bunk in the barn, she said finally. You can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow we'll see. Jonas nodded, relief flooding his features. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Eleanor turned and walked back to the porch, picking up her coffee. I'm still deciding if I'm going to shoot you, she heard Jonas huff. Not quite a laugh, but close. And when she glanced back, he was smiling, really smiling. For the first time since he'd left, Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. When dawn came, the land was quiet again, healed in its way by one man's surrender and one woman's grace. Autumn came soft and golden, like a whisper the valley had been waiting for. The heat broke slowly, giving way to mornings crisp with frost and afternoons painted in amber light. The leaves turned, cottonwoods blazing yellow along the creek, aspens trembling gold on the hillsides. The whole valley transformed into something that looked almost sacred. And through it all, Jonas worked. He rose before dawn, every day, without fail. Eleanor would wake to the sound of him moving in the barn. Boots on wood, the soft murmur of his voice to the horses, the creak of the door as he stepped out into the cold. By the time she came downstairs, coffee brewing, the sun just breaking over the hills, he'd already have split enough wood to last the week. He didn't ask for anything, didn't expect conversation or gratitude or forgiveness. He just worked, mending fences, clearing ditches, repairing the chicken coop that had been falling apart for years. His hands were always busy, his body always moving, as if stillness might give her time to change her mind. And Eleanor watched him. Not openly, not obviously, but she watched. She watched the way he favored his left side when he lifted heavy loads, the old injury from the storm still bothering him. She watched the way he talked to the horses, low and gentle, like they were old friends. She watched the way he paused sometimes, staring out at the valley, his expression distant and sad, as if he were saying goodbye to something he'd never really had. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, the anger began to fade. 3 weeks after Jonas returned, the first real rain came. It started at dusk, soft and steady, drumming against the roof like fingers tapping out a rhythm. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, watching the water sheet down the glass, the yard turning to mud, the hills disappearing into gray mist. Jonas was still outside. She could see him through the rain, securing the barn door, checking the fence line one last time before the storm settled in. He moved quickly, efficiently, his coat already soaked through. Eleanor frowned. She set down the dish towel and walked to the door, pushing it open. Jonas! He looked up, rain streaming down his face. Yeah? Get inside. You'll catch your death out there. He hesitated, glancing back at the barn. I'm almost done. Inside. Now. Jonas nodded and jogged toward the house, his boots splashing through puddles. He stopped at the porch steps, water dripping from his coat, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Come on," Eleanor said, stepping back to make room. "Don't just stand there." Jonas climbed the steps slowly and followed her inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around him immediately, fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of stew simmering on the stove, lamplight soft and golden. He stood just inside the door, dripping onto the floor, looking uncertain. "Take off that coat," Eleanor said, moving to the stove. "You're soaked through." Jonas shrugged out of the coat and hung it on the hook by the door. His shirt clung to his body, damp and cold. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering slightly. Eleanor ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table. "Sit." "Eleanor, I don't want to." "Sit," she repeated, her voice firm. Jonas sat. He stared at the bowl like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve, then picked up the spoon and started eating. Slowly at first, then faster, as if he'd forgotten what real food tasted like. Eleanor poured herself coffee and sat across from him, watching. The rain drummed harder against the windows, the wind picking up, rattling the shutters. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of them in this small pocket of warmth. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly, not looking up from the bowl. "It's just stew. It's more than that." Eleanor didn't respond. She just sipped her coffee and watched him eat, her chest doing something strange and unfamiliar, something that felt like softening. When Jonas finished, he set down the spoon and finally looked at her. "I know you're still angry, and I know I don't deserve this. But I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you tell me to." Eleanor held his gaze. "Why? Why what? Why stay? You've given everything away. You could go anywhere. Start over somewhere no one knows your name. Why stay here?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he said simply, "Because here is where I want to be." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." Jonas leaned forward, his gray eyes steady. "I spent my whole life running, Eleanor, running from my father's shadow, from the weight of a name I didn't choose, from the guilt of things I didn't do but still felt responsible for. And then I came here, and you saved me, not just from the storm, from myself." He paused. "This place, this ranch, this valley, you're the first thing I've ever wanted to fight for instead of run from." Eleanor felt her breath catch. She looked away, her hands tightening around the coffee cup. "You don't know me, Jonas. Not really. You only saw what you wanted to see." "Maybe," Jonas admitted, "but I saw enough. I saw a woman who worked harder than anyone I'd ever met, who pulled a stranger out of a storm and didn't ask for anything in return, who defended me to a town that wanted to hate me." His voice softened. "I saw someone worth staying for." Eleanor's throat was tight. She blinked hard, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. "You hurt me. I know. You made me feel like a fool." "I know," Jonas said again, his voice breaking slightly. "And I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry, Eleanor. If I could go back." "You can't," Eleanor interrupted. "What's done is done. We can't change it." "Then let me make it right," Jonas pleaded. "However long it takes. However many fences I have to fix, however many storms I have to weather. Let me prove to you that I'm not my father, that I'm not the man you think I am." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the scars on his hands, at the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight he carried in his shoulders. He looked like a man who'd been fighting a war for years and finally found something worth surrendering for. "I don't think you're your father," she said quietly. "I never did." Jonas's eyes widened. "Then why?" "Because I was scared," Eleanor admitted. "Scared that if I let myself trust you, you'd leave, and you did. You left, Jonas. And it hurt more than I wanted it to." Jonas reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "I'm not leaving again. Not unless you tell me to." Eleanor stared at his hand, scarred, calloused, trembling slightly. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, and for the first time in months, Eleanor felt something other than anger or hurt or fear. She felt safe. The weeks that followed were quiet, steady, the kind of routine that felt less like surviving and more like living. Jonas worked the ranch like it was his own. Eleanor worked beside him. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The silence between them had changed, transformed from something heavy and awkward into something comfortable, companionable. In the mornings, they'd drink coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the valley. In the afternoons, they'd work, mending tools, tending livestock, preparing for winter. And in the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, Jonas carving small figures from scraps of wood, while Eleanor mended clothes or read from the few books she owned. It was simple, ordinary, and it was everything. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting down like feathers, Eleanor looked up from her sewing and found Jonas watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," Jonas said, but he was smiling. That small, careful smile she'd come to recognize. "You're staring." "I'm appreciating." Eleanor rolled her eyes, but she was smiling too. "Appreciating what?" "This," Jonas said, gesturing to the room. "The fire, the quiet, the snow falling outside. You. The fact that I'm still here." Eleanor set down her sewing. "You sound surprised." "I am, every day." Jonas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream, that I'm still in that storm, dying in the snow." "You're not," Eleanor said softly. "You're here, and you're staying." Jonas's smile widened, just a little. "Yeah, I am." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow. It was coming down harder now, covering the yard, the barn, the fence posts Jonas had set months ago. Everything looked new, clean, like the world was starting over. "Jonas?" "Yeah?" Eleanor turned to face him. "I forgive you." Jonas went still. "What?" "I forgive you," Eleanor repeated, her voice steady. "For not telling me the truth, for leaving, for everything. I forgive you." Jonas stood slowly, his face a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Eleanor, I'm not saying it doesn't still hurt," she continued. "And I'm not saying I trust you completely, not yet. But I want to, and I think you've earned the chance." Jonas crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Eleanor stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. He smelled like wood smoke and snow, and something uniquely him. His heart pounded beneath her palms, fast and strong. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "Thank you, Eleanor." Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself lean into him, let herself feel the solid warmth of him, the safety of his arms. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And it was enough. Winter settled over the valley like a blessing. The snow came steady and deep, transforming the land into something quiet and sacred. The ranch slowed its pace, animals sheltered, work reduced to the essentials, time stretching long and soft. Jonas moved into the house. It happened gradually, the way most important things did. First it was just meals at the table. Then it was evenings by the fire. Then it was his coat hanging beside hers, his boots by the door, his presence woven into the fabric of the house so seamlessly that Eleanor couldn't remember what it had been like without him. They didn't talk about it, didn't make it official. It just was. And Eleanor found herself smiling more, laughing at Jonas's dry humor, at the stories he told about his travels, at the way he talked to the barn cat like it was a person. She found herself looking forward to the mornings, to the sight of him standing at the stove making coffee, his hair still mussed from sleep. She found herself reaching for his hand without thinking, and finding it always there, always ready. One night, deep into winter, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. "You ever think about what comes next?" Jonas asked. Eleanor glanced at him. "Like what?" "I don't know. Spring, summer, the future." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I try not to think too far ahead. Seems like every time I do, life changes the plan." Jonas nodded. "Fair enough." He paused. "But if you did think about it, what would you want?" Eleanor looked up at the stars, at the endless black scattered with light. "I'd want this. Exactly this. The ranch running smooth. The land healthy. Someone to share it with." She glanced at him. "What about you?" Jonas smiled. "Same." "That's it? Just this?" "Just this," Jonas confirmed. "I spent my whole life chasing things I didn't want. Money, power, my father's approval, and none of it made me happy. But this," he gestured to the ranch, the valley, the sky, "this makes me happy. You make me happy." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the cold. You're getting sentimental in your old age. Maybe, Jonas admitted. Or maybe I just finally figured out what matters. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and Jonas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the stars wheel overhead. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever, Eleanor felt at peace. Spring came early that year, the snow melting fast, the land bursting into life almost overnight. Eleanor and Jonas worked the ranch together, planting crops, tending newborn calves, repairing winter damage. The valley filled with color, wildflowers blooming across the hillsides, the creek running high and bright, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. And one morning, as Eleanor stood in the garden pulling weeds, she heard hooves on the road. She looked up to see a small crowd approaching, maybe a dozen people on horseback and in wagons. She recognized some of the faces: Sarah Carson, Thomas, Sheriff Dalton, even Roy Mitchell, though he stayed toward the back. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the edge of the yard. Jonas emerged from the barn, his expression cautious. "Morning," Dalton called out, tipping his hat. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all," Eleanor said, though her heart was pounding. "What brings you all out here?" Dalton dismounted, and the others followed. He held a leather case under one arm, his expression serious but not unkind. "We came to give you something," Dalton said. He opened the case and withdrew a folded document, sealed with wax. After the marker went up, folks started talking about Jonathan, about what he did, and we realized something. "What's that?" Jonas asked quietly. "That he gave everything back," Sarah Carson said, stepping forward. "Every piece of land, every deed. But he kept nothing for himself. No home, no property, nothing." She looked at Jonas, her eyes soft. "That didn't sit right with us. So we took a vote," Thomas added. "Everyone who got their land back, and we decided, unanimous, to give you this." Dalton held out the document. Jonas stared at it like it might bite. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "A deed," Dalton said. "To 40 acres on the North Ridge. Good land, water rights, enough to build a life on." He paused. "It's from all of us, a gift, for what you did." Jonas shook his head, his voice hoarse. "I can't accept that." "You can," Sarah said firmly. "And you will. Because you gave us back our lives, Jonathan. The least we can do is give you a place to build yours." Jonas's throat worked, his eyes shining. He looked at Eleanor, helpless. Eleanor stepped forward and took the deed from Dalton. She looked at the names signed at the bottom, dozens of them. Families Jonas had helped, people who'd once hated the name Hale. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We'll take good care of it." Dalton nodded. "We know you will." He looked at Jonas. "Welcome home, Hale." Jonas couldn't speak. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. The crowd mounted their horses and wagons and rode away slowly, leaving Jonas and Eleanor standing in the yard, the deed between them. When they were alone again, Jonas sank to his knees, his head in his hands. Eleanor knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're okay." "I don't deserve this," Jonas choked out. "I don't deserve any of it." "Maybe not," Eleanor said. "But you're getting it anyway. Because that's what people do when you prove you're worth it." Jonas lifted his head, his face wet with tears. "Eleanor," she kissed him. It was soft, tentative, the kind of kiss that asked a question instead of making a demand. And Jonas answered, his hands coming up to cup her face, his lips warm and gentle against hers. When they pulled apart, Eleanor smiled. "We've got 40 acres to plan for." Jonas laughed, real, full, the sound of something breaking free. "Yeah, we do. They built the house that summer. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid, strong." Jonas laid every beam himself, Eleanor beside him, their hands working together to raise walls and set rafters and shape something out of nothing. The valley watched them build. Neighbors stopped by to help. Sarah Carson bringing food, Thomas delivering lumber, even Mitchell showing up one day with a wagon full of shingles and a grudging nod of approval. By autumn, the house stood complete. Simple, honest, theirs. On the day they moved in, Eleanor stood in the empty front room, her hands on her hips, looking around at the bare walls and clean floors. "It's perfect," she said. Jonas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "It's a start." Eleanor leaned back against him, smiling. "That's all we need. Winter came again, softer this time. The snow fell gently, covering the valley in white, and inside the little house on the north ridge, a fire burned warm and bright. Eleanor and Jonas sat by the hearth, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. Outside the world was quiet, peaceful. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked softly. "Giving everything away?" Jonas was quiet for a moment, then he said, "No, not for a second. Even though you have nothing?" Jonas looked down at her, his eyes warm. "I don't have nothing. I have you. I have this place. I have a life that's mine, not my father's." He paused. "That's not nothing, Eleanor. That's everything." Eleanor smiled and closed her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Yeah, it is." They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, and the warmth of the fire, the snow falling softly outside. And in the quiet, Eleanor thought about gold. About how people spent their whole lives chasing it, digging for it, killing for it. About how they thought it was the answer to everything, to loneliness, to pain, to the empty places inside them. But she'd learned something Jonas had known all along. Gold wasn't in the ground. It wasn't in banks or mines or inheritances. It was in the way a man looked at you like you were the only thing that mattered. It was in the work you did together, the life you built with your hands. It was in the forgiveness you gave and the trust you earned and the love you chose, every single day. That was gold, and they had more of it than they could ever spend. Years passed. The house on the North Ridge grew, a porch added here, a barn there, a garden that bloomed wild and beautiful every spring. The ranch thrived, cattle grazed fat and healthy, crops grew tall, the land healed, the way land does when it's loved, and Eleanor and Jonas grew old together. Their hands grew more weathered, their backs a little stiffer, their hair shot through with gray and then white. But their love stayed constant, steady, the kind of love that didn't need words or grand gestures, the kind that was proven in 1,000 small moments: coffee in the morning, hands held at dusk, quiet laughter in the dark. The valley remembered them, remembered the widow who'd saved a stranger, remembered the heir who'd given everything away, remembered the way they'd built something beautiful out of broken pieces. And when the town erected a second marker, years later, when both of them were gone, it stood beside the first, simple, honest, true. Eleanor Graves and Jonas Hale, who taught us that love is the only fortune worth keeping. One autumn morning, decades after Jonas had first collapsed in the snow, an old woman stood at the fence line of the ranch on the North Ridge. She'd come from the east, tracking down stories, trying to piece together the legend of Jonathan Hale, the heir who'd given everything away. She'd expected to find ruins, emptiness, the aftermath of a man who destroyed himself for nothing. Instead, she found a thriving ranch, cattle grazing, fields green, a small house with smoke rising from the chimney, and on the porch, a man who looked like he might be a grandson or great-nephew, his face weathered and kind. "Can I help you?" he called out. The woman approached slowly. "I'm researching Jonathan Hale, the mining heir. I heard he once lived here." The man smiled. "He did. Built this place with his wife, Eleanor. Lived here till the day he died." "Was he happy?" the woman asked. "After giving everything away?" The man's smile widened. "Happiest man I ever knew. Used to tell me that the only gold worth having was the kind you built with your hands and shared with someone you loved." He gestured to the ranch, the valley, the sky. "Look around. I'd say he was right." The woman looked, and she saw it, saw the legacy, not in money or land or monuments, but in the life that had been lived here, the love that had grown here, the proof that redemption wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime. She thanked the man and walked away, but she kept looking back, at the ranch, at the valley, at the gold hidden in the dust.